Good afternoon, everyone. Thank y'all so much for being here. My name is Ray Pryor. I am a 2015 Ron Brown Scholar. I also run our venture lab and have the pleasure of also hosting our podcast as well. And I will serve as today's host and MC, and super excited to bring together this community and network around an issue that, in one shape or another, I don't think there's a single member of our alumni base that doesn't have a strong passion and connection to. Uh, Certainly, either just through our organization, but through a lot of many other endeavors as well. So, what we'll do to start is I'll give a little bit of context on Ron Brown for some folks who may be watching this live or on replay, and just to make sure that you know who we are. And then, more so, just want to say welcome and thank you for joining us. And we're excited to have you a part of our community. And then I'll shift into a little bit of what the purpose of these summits are and why we've been putting them on over the past several months, and what we're hoping they will turn into. And then I'll kind of lay out what we're going to do for the next few hours in terms of diving into K through 12 education in particular from a few different angles by spotlighting a few of the alumni that we have that have been doing great work in the space for a long time. So I'll start with the organization itself. Maybe before the organization, I'll start with the man, our namesake. The late Secretary Ron Brown was the Secretary of Commerce under President Clinton. He, along with a few dozen others, was tragically died in a plane crash while he was on trade mission in Europe. And out of that tragic, horrific, sudden event, this organization was created by his family, by his friends, by his colleagues that would hope to stand the test of time of living out the legacy that he unfortunately didn't live long enough to see through himself. And there are many things that were involved in living up to a legacy of a man like that. He was a lawyer. He was an army veteran. He was a father. He was a husband. He was an attorney. He was an advocate. He was a statesman and politician, and in addition to his role as Secretary of Commerce, led the DNC and at that time too. So as we look back now, circling around 30 years later this summer of since that day happened in 1996, we will never know the counterfactual of obviously we would have wished that that never have happened, but sometimes it's empowering to think about what he could have done, what could have been possible. And if you think about other people who have stepped into roles of leadership across various domains, all of them have been great. All of them have in some way learned from Ron Brown, but none of them had Ron Brown over the last 30 years to mentorship, to advise, to learn from. And a lot of scholars didn't either. None of us had the privilege of being able to have him directly in our lives. But through this organization, we've been able to continue his legacy in a really powerful way. So one of the core ways that the organization has done that is simply through the scholarship. That's most likely what we're well known for, and what most people are familiar with. A lot of people's first engagement is a scholarship. But what is different than this scholarship, and any Ron Brown scholar will tell you that many of them were fortunate enough to have gotten multiple, is that most scholarships are writing a check and allowing you to go on with your business. Very few of them are committed to creating, cultivating, and sustaining a lifelong network of all of these young people that have won this scholarship throughout their entire lives and careers, and at every single milestone. And so just as the program has grown over 30 years, as the scholars have grown over 30 years, and the program has grown alongside them as well. And so after maybe the first decade or so, you could call it, we were focusing on not just giving scholarships, but providing a lot of wraparound support that low income, African American, brilliant, talented students need in order to go to all of the best schools in the country and in the world that they have. But we didn't just want to stop there. We also evolved further to going a bit further than just the senior year of high school, of making college possible for them, but making their path shortly after college successful too. And so we started the Leaders Network to focus specifically around career development and making sure that the access to those essential internships and first full-time opportunities outside of undergrad, making sure that our scholars had access to those, and that the pipelines and networks that their classmates at Harvard and Yale and Stanford may have inherited from before they went to school, not often Ron Brown scholars had that to tap into for their career objectives. And so they would lean back into Ron Brown for that. And so the Leaders Network has been helping thousands of students with their career goals since then. And it's included captains who are just as much alumni of the program as scholars. These are folks who also applied for our scholarship. due to limited resources, weren't able to win the scholarship, but by all intents and purposes, are just as much of a part of our community as anyone else. And so we added them to the fold, really expanding out the size and the scale of the organization through that. And then about 10 years ago, I think also the 10-year anniversary will be I think this year. We went even earlier in the life cycle of a Ron Brown Scholar and started our guided pathway support program, which is college access program for high school students. So students as early as sophomore year, any African American student anywhere and at any time was able to access the same types of private college counseling that some families pay thousands of dollars for in order for their students to understand the college process, understand financial aid, understand scholarships, understand how to position yourself as a candidate. We packaged all of that, all of the wisdom that we all took to get to all of the schools that we were going to, packaged it in a program that could access any student anywhere at any time for free, through an app, through a social media app. Well before the COVID-19 pandemic took us all remote and made the platforms like Zoom that we're using today very popular, and certainly well before the types of conversations I'm sure that will come up today about how we can use technology to democratize access to information and advice and counseling. We're 10 years ahead of the curve, and certainly have served almost 10,000 students just in that GPS program. So our GPS navigators are also alumni of the Ron Brown Scholar Program as well. And then we've added a bunch of other things too. We've had a STEM alliance of our scientists and engineering folks who are wanting to make sure that Ron Brown folks are at the forefront of those fields, and certainly they're very well represented. A few years ago, we also added the Venture Lab, which is what I lead and focuses on the founders and investors and entrepreneurs and innovators and builders that are in our space, some of which you'll hear from today. We're always thinking of new ways that we can continue to add value over the course of the lifespan of our alumni. But it is really the easiest job in the world because these are already really brilliant people, as you will see later on today. And so most of the time, our job is enabling things where we can, being a catalyst to make sure that certain things happen or certain connections are able to be made across our network. But when great people get into the room, you don't really need to do much. And sometimes the best thing is to just step out of the way and let them work their magic. And so that's what my role will primarily be today. Is helping to facilitate and moderate a few panels. But I'm super excited just to present to you some folks that we have at K through 12 education. My hunch is that people like who are listening to this who are interested in education, as I have been and am, are also interested in it because of all of the other things that it touches, and certainly interested in supporting young people as they find their path. And so, what you might also find interest is that we have done summits like this on other industries too. We started with artificial intelligence, where we had 12 of our alumni who are AI PhDs or AI founders and builders present their research as well as demo their products. And so you might find some of the things that they're working on there of interest, and certainly can help you make sense of how important and dominant AI is, but also how Ron Brown folks are thinking about and leveraging it for the good of our communities, of the world, and all of that. And then a few months after that, we also did healthcare. And there are I think in terms of advanced degrees, so some quick statistics that, I think it's over vast majority of our students get degrees from Ivy League schools. The Ivy League plus of all the ones that are in that camp, I'm sure it is close to maybe 80 or 90%. The graduation rate is 99%, and half of those scholars, at least so far, have advanced degrees. And of those advanced degrees, I would bet that a majority of them are medical doctors. And so a lot of folks who are interested in healthcare, and certainly with all of the changes to the economy as well as technology, healthcare is an important space, and it's great to see Ron Brown scholars leading there. So we did healthcare. We also did life sciences, which is a bit more focused on biotech and pharma and how we can leverage technology to unlock the science behind medicine as well as the delivery of medicine that we focused on in the healthcare summit. But of all of the issues that scholars and alumni care about, education is certainly one of them. And we will continue to do other industries, spotlighting other folks, trying to create a version of, if we were to do a TEDx conference just of our alumni on a particular topic, this is what we would try to capture over Zoom. So I feel free to check that out on our YouTube channel. This will also be posted there. And yeah, I'm super excited for today's programming. You will be able to engage with our speakers through the chat. Me and the speakers will do our best to be tracking it while we're also talking. But in the event that we miss it, we've baked in Q&A sessions for the end. So if you want to drop it there while it's top of mind, feel free to do so. And then throughout the Q&A session, you can continue to drop questions through there. And the real purpose of all of these summits, one, is just to put all of our talent on display. I mean, we haven't even touched law yet. We haven't touched entertainment, but we've done AI, we've done healthcare, we've done life sciences. There are so many other things that we could do. And most importantly, we want to make sure that the world, as well as other folks on the network, know who are the people who are leading across all of these domains that you should keep in touch with and keep track of. But what we're really hoping and was kind of the original vision of Tony Polaro, our founder, and certainly our president and CEO, Michael Mallory, is that Ron Brown scholars together across all of these disciplines, across all of these schools and degrees would pool all of their skills and their talents and their networks together to address very complex dynamic issues. And in terms of a set of superheroes, if the world certainly is in need of a version of the Avengers to attack some of their most challenging problems, he always saw that the Avengers would come from all of the different pieces of the Ron Brown network. And so certainly, I hope that you enjoy the conversations that we have today, that they're insightful, enlightening, and that you take something away from it. But more importantly, I hope that you stay connected to the people who are a part of this and you find a way to plug in with them. And so feel free to use me as your conduit to do so, and to reach out to me if there are any folks that stood out to you today, or that you are working on something and that should have been on the stage today. I would love to hear about that. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. I'm going to turn off this screen share and make sure I set up my screen here for our speakers. And I think Ryan is ready. So I appreciate your patience, Ryan, as I gave our intro and set everything up. But really just want to thank you for being here and for making the time to kick off our our education summit. Perhaps I can let you give a bit of your background, Ryan, but maybe I'll tell the audience a little bit about why I wanted to kick things off with you and why I wanted to share. I can share a little bit about what about your background was compelling to me as I was thinking about this. I saw this with our healthcare summit that K through 12 education is something that a lot of people have opinions about, because in one way or in some form or fashion we might all experience it, whether it's while we were kids or whether we have kids or whether we're concerned about it more broadly. And so a lot of people have opinions, but there are a lot of different angles of moving the needle on outcomes in education. And normally to do so in a system like that requires a bit of breadth of perspective that most people don't have the luxury of seeing, certainly not if you were just a student. Even my brief stint as a classroom educator, even if you are just working for an education nonprofit, or if you are working as a policymaker, it's hard to see all of how all of these things connect and to make sense of where you can make a difference. You have touched, I think, nearly every job there might be to have, except for a few more that you probably are next on your hit list in this space. And so a lot of times I talk to Ron Brown scholars about them figuring out clarity on where do they really want to make a difference. It's not that there is any shortage of things that they could do. It's really about them wanting to get better judgment on where they can move the needle in a way that makes a difference to the world as well as to themselves. And so the breadth of experience that you have across the sector, I thought, could help us make sense of where does power sit? Where does potential for impact sit? Where should we transparently perhaps spend less time, not waste our time, not waste our resources, if there's no real return in doing so? So anyway, just wanted to share all of that has made me excited for you to be here, and you've also just been a great counsel to folks interested in education and the network for a while, as well as particularly to our GPS program too. So thank you, Ryan, for being here. What I want to start is just maybe have you kick off any other parts of your background, if you'd like to get more specific, that you want to highlight today, just to kind of frame your experience for the audience, and then I'll jump into some questions that I've been eager to ask you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really excited to be here. I always love having the opportunity to come back to Ron Brown based events and speak to members of the network, speak to especially students as they're rising up and becoming college students in and of their own. So it's always great to have this opportunity. So thanks for having me here. I have had the great privilege of being able to do a number of different things across the education sector. And so I think a couple of pieces that I hone in on are one, I started my career as a middle school algebra and physical science teacher in East Palo Alto, California. And so I always try to hold on to that as my kind of educational center. No matter where else in the education sphere I'm at, I always come back to what am I doing that would help the version of me that's working with students in that classroom every day. So that math teacher, part of my career bio, part of my story, my personality, I try to keep that first and foremost. I had the opportunity to work in district administration, nonprofit leadership, leading the state education agency, doing work in the consulting space in education. So I've gotten a lot of various viewpoints to the issues that concern education, the issues that concern educators, and I will say that as we talk about this, education is really fascinating because there's just so many different parts of the system that have this interplay together, and where you want to make a difference and how for kind of what group that's within that space. There's plenty of opportunity and both challenges and benefits that go along with all of those. So hopefully as we go through today, we can kind of touch on that and think about it from some of those different vantage points.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And I certainly want to circle back to perhaps what might have influenced the evolution of your career to those different stages and angles. Where I want to start, mainly from somebody like you, there's a lot of noise around what education needs to look like, what it should be, what it could be, where it falls short, and what I often uh, struggle with is knowing through all of that noise how the underlying system and powers that be actually work versus the things that we read headlines about and hear opinions about and talk about, but don't really understand the inner workings of how the system overall works. If you can even call it, even calling it a system doesn't really describe anything or make anything more clear than just needing a term to describe all that it is. But maybe just today, and certainly perhaps it's evolved throughout history. When you think about where um, the the rule makers of the education system sit, where the power within the education system sit, where the decision making power sits, since I assume that's of most interest to our audience who are looking to be boots on the ground in the education system, innovators and researchers who are looking to move the needle. Where do you look that where would we find that perhaps isn't the thing that takes up headlines or isn't
Yeah.
the thing that would draw the most attention, but certainly probably warrants more focus for people who really want to make a difference.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question, and when I think about it, I would split it into a couple of different frames. And so the first frame are folks who are interested. You kind of use the phrase, how do you make change in the education sphere? Well, first I'll look at change in the classroom. So when we think about change in the classroom, we want the actual learning experience for the students who are in classrooms every day to be modern, high class, effective, prepare them for a successful life post graduation. And so much of what we think about with change in the classroom, the actual teaching and learning, the single biggest in school factor that's going to make a difference for kids is going to be the quality of your teacher. I think there's been kind of repeated research on it that has shown teacher quality is the one in school variable that has the highest impact on outcomes. Now, there's lots of other out of school variables that touch on it, sometimes even more so than what happens in school. But in school, the quality of that teacher and what we call the instructional core. So that is the relationship between the teacher, the student, and the content that they're learning, and that instructional core. Do you have a high quality teacher with a very sound curriculum in solid relationship with their students to move them forward? That is what makes kind of that day-to-day change in the classroom. And so the biggest lever to impact what happens in the classroom isn't, like you said, what you see in the headlines. It's not, education secretary McMahon. It's not dismantling of the Department of Ed. It's not kind of any of that that gets so much off. It really is from a power perspective, a lot of what happens at the school board level and in the C suite of a school district. And that's where most of our nation students are in a school district school. And so when you're really thinking about making changes there, the decisions that get made by leaders in those systems, whether you're a board member, whether you're a superintendent, assistant superintendent, principal, kind of up and down the line, getting involved in those are going to have the most impact on what actually happens in the classroom. That's everything from what curricula get taught. That's everything from what policies get put in place. Are you going to use AI? Are you not going to use AI? How are you going to use it? Those decisions are getting made on that local level, and there's tremendous power to be had there. And so I think for those who are really looking at that part of the system to try to make change, really pays to be attentive to what is happening in those spaces and being involved in those spaces. And the incredible thing is, they are incredibly accessible. You go to most school board meetings in most places, it's a handful of people, if that,
Sure.
who have outsized influence on a community. And getting the right people in those communities to make sure that the right kinds of decisions are being made to really put resources, access, and opportunity in front of the kids who need it most. It's hard to really overstate kind of the impact that that can have in that local space.
Yeah.
So I say that at the local level, and that's change in the classroom. But when we're talking more broadly and things that do grab headlines, oftentimes we're talking about changes in resource allocation or changes in access to opportunities. Uh, and most of the resources, the way we're set up in the US, most of those decisions happen at the state level. So that is where your state legislatures, much more so than the federal government. And depending on where you live, probably a lot more than your local government. Those state level governments hold tremendous power over what kinds of resources get allocated to where. And I think we've seen in, I'd say, the fairly recent past, there's been more and more of a shift toward trying to put more of the resource allocation decisions at the state level as opposed to the local level, and trying to make those somewhat more equalized across communities across the state. But that varies widely depending on which state you live in, and sometimes even which communities within those states. So we have places where the playing field has, for the most part, at least made a good faith attempt to be level. Probably not actually there yet, but at least made some sort of good faith attempt. And other places where you still have just these wild imbalances from the haves and the have-nots. So one last interesting thing I'll say about this one before we move on is, right now there's a very interesting interplay between healthcare and education when it comes to access to resources. So as states are the main funders of education, and as state budgets are getting squeezed by some of the decisions being made with regard to healthcare, particularly cuts to programs like SNAP and Medicaid, that is putting tremendous pressure on state budgets. And when that happens, education, being such a huge expense of every state government, is part of what's going to get squeezed. So when you see these cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAP, cuts to other things that states have really come to depend on, and in some cases are trying to replace when they lose it from the federal government, just know that that has a big power implication for education and what resources are and are not going to be made available to kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I've heard it articulated that in a lot of ways, healthcare can kind of be the thermometer to just kind of catch all for the health literally, but just like the state of a society, that all of the things that healthcare can receive, but certainly for our young people, including their healthcare, everything that is happening outside in the world or anything that's happening in any other sector is going to show up in some way,
Hmm.
shape, or form in schools and in the classroom. I want to ask you about this, and we're a nonprofit organization, 501(c)(3). We don't get into politics. We don't endorse candidates. We don't do that. So I'm not asking you a personal political question or that.
Hmm.
I'm more so asking about you to lay out the map of the party politics across education, because I think it looks a bit different than perhaps other issues might, and making sense of that amidst all of the other political issues that people certainly care about, I think would be helpful as particularly leaders who to know who they're talking to and how to articulate and what values are aligning with certain parties, and perhaps it changes over time, certainly in different states. Can you, if I don't know if it's as simple as what does the left believe, what does the right believe, but what is your sense of where certain political affiliations land on certain issues, maybe just the high level ones, and where, if in particularly, where might that differ or feel a bit different than what we might expect, or what the alignment on other issues might be that
Yeah,
might look a little bit different when we're talking about schools and boards and all those things.
yeah. So that's really interesting because I think education, probably more so than a lot of other issues, is a place where you can have very unexpected coalitions or
Mhm.
bedfellows, so to speak, and interesting coalitions of who's for and who's against that don't break down on easy party politics.
Right.
So I can tell you, as the Secretary of Education for the state of New Mexico, I think we were able to do quite a lot of interesting things. Uh, really good, put together some really good policy that crossed party lines. So most of the things that we introduced and really put impetus behind, we were able to get near unanimous votes in a fairly purple state of in both houses of the legislature, and that could be for anything from finance bills to we passed a lot more programs and policies aimed at trying to provide more access and opportunity for students who were deemed kind of most in need, or the term at risk can be controversial, but at risk was a term that was used. And those typically had broad bipartisan support. I think that when it comes to education, there's a lot of things that you see there being widespread agreement on. Things like career and technical education. So, moving away from what the prior like trade oriented, more toward career advancement, career connected learning, broad bipartisan support. Everyone wants to see kind of more connection with tangible opportunities to move into the post secondary world of work with strong credentials. I think you see a lot of bipartisan support for things like right now, science of reading is very hot, and changing the way in which we teach reading to kids to make sure that the instruction aligns with what research has been showing us to be most effective. So there's areas like that where kind of across the aisle you see people really coming together. I think some of the areas that tend to be more divisive, but not universally so, on a partisan basis, we've seen more testing the limits of what we see as the separation of church and state when it comes to schools. And that has had some implications with some recent Supreme Court decisions, from Ten Commandments in classrooms, praying at football games, some of the things that have come before the court. And so you have seen various politicians on the right stake out some very strong positions on that, which have been countered by primarily politicians on the left. I think that has become a partisan issue. I think all of the conversation right now around transgender students and participation in sports teams, that has become a very partisan issue, right and left. I think that the issue of charter schools and I'll put school vouchers similarly in this category, has somewhat become partisan, but hard to actually pin that down in a partisan way,
Right.
because I think you can find strong coalitions on both sides of the aisle, both for and against those particular issues. Generally speaking, though, I think those kinds of issues are a little bit more on the fringe. They take up a lot of the oxygen,
Yeah.
but that's not the 95 to 98% of the budget, time, attention, and resources that actually go into the educational process. Those are the things that are really operating on the margins, and where people are trying to stake their claims and make kind of make their claim for where they stand on some of these issues.
Right. Yeah. Well said. I appreciate you walking through that. Maybe circling back to you and all of the experience that you've had, can you walk us through a few of the chapters of when you were in one role and chose to not just explore a different one, but kind of be involved in education from a different seat? Could be the more recent ones, it could be the earlier ones. I think all of them would be of interest. But my hunch is that a lot of folks who are following in your path will likely do a bit of that discovery themselves, and
Mhm.
perhaps hearing from you about how you thought about when the chapter of you being in the classroom ended versus when you were leading the Department of Ed in New Mexico versus what you're doing now. How you thought through that, I think, would be insightful for them to hear.
Yeah. So started my career as a classroom teacher, which I didn't think, that's not what I went to school for. I didn't think that's where I was going to go. It kind of came about in yeah, I just as I was becoming disillusioned with the idea of going to Wall Street right after college, really started to embrace and lean into the fact that much of what I had valued in my life up to that point, as I was thinking about my career, was working with kids and leaning into service. And so thinking about that, I had the opportunity to become a teacher, and I said, that actually seems like something I think I would enjoy, and would be much more fulfilling to me, a lot more than well, the path I thought I was going to go down into Wall Street. So, so became a teacher. Really, really loved my kids, my school, working in that community. I found the passion to hone my craft continually and get better. Think of new ways to connect with students and to connect curriculum in ways that could make it tangible for them was something for me that was really rewarding, both on a personal level and on a kind of mental challenge level. And so, really enjoyed that, but also found myself after several years of doing that having both the interest and opportunity to try to kind of spread that work, that ethos to others. So I had the opportunity to become a mentor for new teachers and work as an instructional coach across multiple campuses in our school district. And so for me, that was a way to kind of broaden the impact, but still stay connected to the classroom and to the curriculum. So that was a really interesting way for me to kind of think about my career in a new but related way. And after doing that, I did that for about 5 years and kind of got to one of those inflection points where the program through which I was doing that was sunsetting for financial reasons, and I was trying to think of kind of what my next move was. And so that's when I decided if I really want to be a part of some of those changes that I talked about at the outset here around local leadership and making change in the classroom, I needed to go back and invest in my own growth, development, and education some more, so I'd be able to have the knowledge and credentials to be able to hold one of those seats and be a district administrator. So I went back and got my graduate degree, got my doctorate in education leadership, really with that intention of I want to go back into a school district as a leader and be able to try to make some of these changes that I think are so important. So went back into a very big school district where we had school district of Philadelphia, many hundreds of thousands of kids in our schools every day. And I talk about it a little bit more, but yeah, you get inside one of those big bureaucracies and you experience all the good and the bad that there is to do there. So I had the opportunity to do some things that I think were really impactful and things that were really interesting to me around how we innovate in the schools, how we think differently about how and where we allocate resources, trying to make that more equitable. But at a certain point, I looked around and realized I think I've done what I'm going to be able to do in this setting. I think I've reached my ceiling, and I'm the kind of person who I will get bored if I'm doing the same thing year in and year out, and and I'm not feeling like it's dynamic anymore. So, so that's when I had the opportunity to move into the nonprofit sector and join an organization that was trying to make change kind of from the outside in and doing some really good work with schools in that point. And so I started doing that work, still working with some Philly schools, working with some schools in New York, trying to think about more of a instructional change management approach to that. When I got a call from the governor's office in New Mexico saying the governor would like to talk to you, I had no idea why. I was like, maybe she wants to hire our nonprofit, but I don't know why the governor would be calling, not the secretary of it. I don't know what this is about. And then the next thing I know, uh, she's telling me that she's looking for a secretary of education, and my name had made it onto her radar. And when I come out and interview for this position, and so I'm thinking, you probably had like a Brian Stewart on your list, and so somehow you forgot the B is because I wasn't a state policy guy at that time. I wasn't looking for a job. I hadn't applied for it. I didn't have ties to New Mexico, but here she is asking me to come out and interview. And so I thought, well, you don't turn that down when a governor reaches out. But at the same time, I'm not going to get this job. There's no way. It's just not my profile. But I went out there, gave it my best, put my best foot forward in the interview, and a little while later, I get the call saying, you're our selection. Would you come out and take the job?" So before you know it, I was packing up the car, driving cross country, and taking on a brand new adventure that I never had envisioned that I would be doing. And I'm so glad that I did, because for me it was just the most incredible experience to be able to do that work and serve in that way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And now I think you're back in Philly,
That's right.
quickly. I want to ask you a more serious question, but a more lighthearted question too. My family loves Abbott Elementary, the show. And
Hmm.
how do Philly educators feel about the show? Do they feel this is exactly the story we needed told? Do they feel I don't know that this was is it helping? I don't know. I'm just curious about how you feel since you were sitting inside of the institution that gets profiled many times in the show and often comedic, not so great
Yeah.
ways, but ways that might be real and just reflect reality. So yeah, curious on your thoughts about the show if you've had a chance to watch it or yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, Abbott Elementary is a great show, a real genius show. I love it, and I think Philly educators love it generally.
Yeah.
It One of the genius parts about the show that I appreciate so much is you have this big urban school system, right? And when you hear the words "big urban school system," everybody starts thinking, "Well, or is this Freedom Riders? Is this Dangerous Minds? Is this Standby?" Like, everyone has certain images of what it is. And you go into Abbott Elementary, part of the genius is, no, these are like just really smart, hardworking, great teachers and really smart, funny, full of potential kids in this system that's got all of its good, its bad, its challenges, its thing it's trying to figure out, and just trying to make things work in these circumstances. And without, I think, trying to paint these and stay within the stereotypes as they're so generally portrayed, and being funny while doing it. So no, I love Abbott Elementary, and it's become a real Philly institution.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear. That's cool. I think you described it at some point when you were in the district, you felt like you had plateaued.
Mm.
And I am similar that way that if and when I get bored, it's a bad situation. Normally it means I need to move on, add something new, do something different. Stepping out a bit more about when people are thinking about spending a career in education. Do you think that that is an experience they should expect? That there are times when you will step into roles that for a time you may graduate from and it just kind of is what it is that if you want to be in this sector and you take a certain title, it comes with certain responsibilities that you don't necessarily get to change a whole lot? Or do you think the attitude of whatever space that you're in, whatever title you have, whatever role you have some opportunity to make that whatever you want it to be and to evolve that along with you. I think you think about your career differently versus when you think this is you're 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 executing a term or you're doing this for a certain period of time and it's about excellence in the job versus bringing the more innovative ideation entrepreneurial spirit to this where it may get rejected. And I know that can be disheartening and discouraging and a lot of things when you experience that when you were hoping for more. So how have you thought about that since you've seen a lot of different angles and certainly
Yeah.
have a lot of ideas? How do you balance knowing that, I think this is it. This is kind of what I was able to do. It may not be all that I want to do, versus kind of pushing against that and wanting to do more than perhaps people might already expect you to do.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of personality. Your own the way you personally get energy from a job that comes into this answer. Because there's folks like me. It sounds like folks like you who, after a while, you might find that if there's not something so dynamically new to a position, that you feel like you've done what you've come to do in that position, and it's time to move forward. Uh, Whereas there might be others who get deep fulfillment from continuing to build on that expertise and having a very long arc and longevity in doing something well over time, repeatedly, and coming back to it and executing well. And that's where I think you see some of your best 20-year, 30-year teachers, folks who are consistently honing their craft, Every year they're thinking, how am I going to do this a little bit different or better, knowing what they're good at and also continually working on the things where they need to grow. Those people are gold in the education sphere. You find them and they are so kind of committed to that ongoing growth and consistency. But I think that if you're one of those people like me, like you, uh, you might feel the want, need, and desire to explore different parts of the education sector because there are so many. We have to have I mean, it starts with having great teachers, but we need great principals. We need great school board members, school leaders. We need great policymakers who are connected to classrooms. Like those are essential parts of the ecosystem. So I think it's healthy to have a balance of people who are going to want to stay in the classroom for a very long time and who are going to want to take on some of these other roles that are critical to making that system work.
Yeah, well said. We certainly need both, and yeah, that's great. We got two more questions, and then we'll just kind of wait in the chat to see if other folks have things, and I can read them out to you and share them before we reach the top of the hour. First is about how you said that you know quality teachers is the number one variable, and in quality leadership at the school and district level is crucially important. Shifting to the education leadership, like, principals as well as school district leaders that are great, that are excellent, however you would like to define that. What are the characteristics of those types of people? Are they always the best classroom educators that then all translate into the best administrators? Perhaps does that not happen, and that's not necessarily the right archetype for people who are thinking about wanting to be in one of the seats that makes one of these important decisions? Could it be that they bring experience from other sectors, even, or other thing? Do they, most of the time? It sounds like you certainly need to be. Grad school is probably something you need to at least consider or think about if you're wanting to pursue some of these roles. I guess I'm trying to think about if you could construct an archetype of a Ron Brown scholar who is positioned to be right at that power seat that you were talking about. What do you think are most important that they have in their toolbox and in their past, and that they consider as they think about working their way towards a seat like that?
Yeah. So let me hone in on kind of one position that gets a lot of maybe hits a lot of what you're talking about. I'm thinking about like the superintendent of a large school system. Define large how you will, 25,000 students, 200,000 students, New York City, what have you. Superintendent of a large school system. You've got many different constituencies that you're working with. I think it's probably the most complex job that one of the most complex jobs that you can possibly have. Because on the one end, you've got your students who you're the core of why you exist to make sure that the students of that district get a great education. You have their families, all of whom have various desires for what education should look like and what opportunities should be presented along the way. You have the public, for whom the school system is likely the biggest expense, maybe even the biggest employer in the community. You've got government, whether that's your city government, then you also likely have a school board. Oftentimes, those are two separate entities, each of which has different ways of helping control. And then you have a state government, which has its own opinions about what should happen in your local district. And then you have a federal government, which is also putting policies out that are impacting you. And then you have a press and media environment that is heavily scrutinizing all the moves that you make. So within that, there are, I think, a few different things that, if that's the position that you want to hold, are really important to think through. So one, when you touched on this at the start, understanding deeply what good instruction is. And so it's hard to do that if you've never been in the place of actually having to lead a classroom. Now, we certainly have had some of the superintendents who have come in without that experience, some of whom have been successful. I think there was a very big push at a certain point in time, not too long ago, to get more CEO type, may not have had to have instructional background into that position. I think that we have moved away from that recently, uh, and those kinds of initiatives. In education, there's always a backlash, though, so we'll probably be back to it before too long. But I think now people really are looking for more individuals who do have some experience leading classrooms, understanding great instruction. But in addition, There is a lot around leading organizations and building community and coalitions that is essential to that job. Because essentially, when you're the superintendent, even though you're putting forward the vision for what great instruction should look like and leading and stewarding that, you are having to build the coalitions to help you deliver on that. And so thinking about how you show up in community, how you build partnerships across different types of stakeholder groups, how you navigate the politics that are inherent in your school board, your city, whoever's funding you. All of those pieces are really important. And then understanding yourself and being very comfortable with yourself and who you are as a leader and how you inspire others is something that just really shouldn't be overlooked. Like you really have to know yourself, your leadership style, and what it takes to get the people on board with your agenda and really move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was great. Last one I have for you is about. I'm just going to kind of segue us into our next few sessions about impact of technology and AI in the classroom.
Mhm.
And certainly, everyone has thoughts and feelings about that. From your seat, what do you think warrants more of our attention, and where you think things could really make a difference, versus where do you think this is more us, trying to code our way out of problems that have nothing to do with technology per se, or what what types of technological tools that students have access to, or that parents have access to, or that teachers use. And maybe perhaps if you can also frame your response specifically to a lot of ed tech folks and builders and investors and founders that are Ron Brown scholars as well, who are trying to make sense of this, who certainly are leading the work. But I think therefore your voice and opinion on what they're doing and how they're approaching it, I think they would appreciate and hold in high esteem. So what what are your thoughts about where opportunities exist, or where we might be getting distracted on what really matters?
There was a term, I believe I learned this in grad school. It's really stuck with me. The term is isomorphism, and it's the state in which basically things that are a certain shape try to maintain that shape even when they're faced with pressure. And education is the perfect example. There's a reason why going to a high school classroom right now, it probably doesn't look that much different than the high school classroom of your parents or grandparents and in its basic structure. Education fights very hard to look and function the same. And so AI, I think, like it is everywhere else, will be a disruptive technology, but the extent to which it actually has meaningful disruption that has a positive impact is a very much an open question. Because I think there was a at first a big hope that basically AI was just going to replace teachers. Technology was going to replace it, and then AI specifically was going to turbocharge that. And I think what we've clearly seen is nobody wants to sit in front of a screen all day and be taught by an algorithm, and that hasn't proven to be effective way of doing it. And so I think there's more of a shift away from recognizing that that is not in and of itself going to be the trajectory in which AI is going to really make a difference. I think there are a few areas in which if I were building an AI company focused on creating great learning experiences, I would really focus. And one of them is AI that helps students build understanding. So I think right now, a lot of the conversation about AI for students is they're just plugging in a prompt to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and then putting their name on it and turning it in. And they're not doing any of that mental cognitive work to actually build up their own intellectual capacity. And I think that's true to the detriment of a lot of students and a lot of institutions. So AI for building understanding, I think is going to be very different than that. And that is going to be AI that helps students connect to content in ways that better help them say have a hook from from their own lived experience to what the content is actually trying to share. So ways that they can connect with content, ways that they can internalize content that's new and different, and ways that help them, say, maybe pull together summaries and practice questions and study guides that in ways that we couldn't necessarily do or required a teacher to put that together for you and package for you. Now you can do a lot of that on your own. And so I think the better we get it with tools that help kids build those connections and deepen understanding, that will be incredibly impactful. I think I that will help strengthen and sharpen students' arguments and knowledge bases similarly will be helpful. Things that can point you to alternative, strong, and credible sources, things that can critique arguments and make you consider alternate points of view, ways that you can use AI to interact with whether people or ideas that really challenge your own. And the last, I would say, using AI to help communicate thoughts and ideas in novel ways. So we know that AI can be used to create podcasts. AI can be used to produce infographics and designs and process flows in ways that most students wouldn't have been able to have access to. Most teachers wouldn't have been able to have access to. And so I think AI that helps do that, if you can find an AI that can tap into the preferred learning modality that connects with a wide group of students in a short period of time, but still kind of deepens at the heart of whatever it is, the goal that you're trying to teach. I think those kinds of innovations in education are going to be very helpful, and things that focus a lot more on helping people generate a lot of content without doing that cognitive work will be ultimately harmful to education.
Yeah, well said. I appreciate your request for edtech startups and those three pillars. That was great. So we're coming close to the end of our time. Would highly encourage anybody who has a question to drop it into the chat, and I can share that with Ryan. While folks are typing or thinking through and gathering their thoughts from our conversation, Ryan, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing now and kind of where people how people can just keep up with your work, and if you are looking to connect with people in a particular domain or a certain space or geography. Yeah, we'll just give maybe just sharing a little bit of that, and then as folks have questions, we can wrap up, and folks can know how to keep up with you and what you're doing.
Great. Well, after stepping down from the secretary role in New Mexico, I moved back to Philly, and I'm the proud founder and CEO of Mile 2 Consulting. And the reason it's called Mile 2 is because my son is named Miles. And when he was learning to write his name, he would write the S backwards and kind of off centered. So it looked like Mile 2. So he is the namesake for my company, and he says he gets royalties. But so the work that we do is really focused on the intersection of healthcare and education. So what we do is we help school districts and institutions of higher education connect with the Medicaid program to be able to get reimbursements for the health services that they offer to students, primarily students with disabilities in K 12. So things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, social work, counseling. Schools can get reimbursed for that, but managing that process and maximizing your reimbursement is hard work. So we help them maximize it, get those returns so they can reinvest it in their students who have the highest degrees of need.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's reminding me of the Travis Gales, who's I think
Mhm.
he's a Devon scholar
Yep.
before in his current role of Howard Brown Health now. Spent time at a startup that sits at the education of intersection of education and healthcare, and how certainly there are already in either system there are a lot of things to do. Marrying them together normally
Yeah.
doesn't just you don't just get double the complexity. You might even get more in terms
Yeah.
of what all the things that need to coordinate. So very cool that you're working on that, and appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
Um,
Good buddy Travis. He's always doing good work.
yeah, yeah, indeed. Well, Ryan, this has been great. I appreciate you kicking us off, just kind of painting the picture for what really matters in the education sector. Where can people help find where they sit? That it is okay for that seat to change over time. It's also okay for that seat not to change if you find that you are one of those folks who can be excellent and build expertise over time, and also giving us perspective on positions of leadership. What does it require to do all of that? And certainly, I think for me, increase the level of respect and admiration I have for folks like you who choose to go into those roles when you don't have to. There are a lot of other opportunities you could have, and but serving the public in this way is something that's hard to do. So we just thank you for doing it, and yeah, looking forward to keeping up with you and everything else that you're doing. Anything else you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up this part of the session?
Huge thank you to Mike Mallory, of course, fearless leader, and the Polaro family, and just keep up doing the great work. The Ron Brown Network is just such a blessing. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah, indeed, indeed. Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
All right. So what we're going to do now is shift to the second part of our time today, where we're going to hear from some scholars who are actively building in education. A lot of the things that Ryan was discussing and that he was excited about, concerned about, wanting us to keep in mind. We have folks who are living and breathing that every single day, and so we were hoping to have three. I shared a little bit of his podcast earlier for Tyrone. Maybe I'll give a quick plug on Tyrone and what he's doing. You can find him on our registration page too. Uh, but I think he's perhaps a 2018 Ron Brown Scholar from New York. Is back in New York now. Spent some time in a hedge fund. Is now working on an ed tech startup that's helping students with standardized test prep and leveraging a lot of LLMs to do that. But his path to getting there involved a lot of iterations around what AI can do very differently. And so, would highly encourage folks who are interested in ed tech to just keep up with Tyrone. And he had an emergency come up to where he couldn't be here. But great guy and great person to stay connected to. And Ron Brown is lucky that we don't just have one MIT grad who's interested in education technology and building. We have probably more than two. Certainly, we have at least two. The second one is here. Jimmy, great to see you and appreciate you coming back to be a part of this. Jimmy's going to kind of serve dual roles today. One, he's going to put on his founder hat and talk about a bit about what he's building in his company, focus on leveraging AI for students and educators. And then he's also going to put on his researcher hat too and kind of walk through a few things that have been evolving in how we test and what the future of assessments can look like for students. Of all of those things that we discussed are of the complexities of the education system. For better or not, we need to have some form or way of knowing whether it's working or not. And normally, assessments have to be a part of that conversation. But the same assessment that we all took when we were kids, a lot has changed, and a lot will continue to change. And hopefully for the better. And Jimmy and the group that he works with has been a part of doing that too. And then in a little bit, perhaps, yeah, maybe in about 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'm going to have Sean Filer come on too, who's doing some great work with AI and leveraging that technology for school boards. Very relevant to our conversation that we just had with Ryan. So, Jimmy, I'm just going to pass it over to you. You've got you're like 10 minutes or 15 minutes to show whatever you'd like for us to show. And then I'll have Sean come on and then I'll bring you back in a little bit to do your longer presentation. But really appreciate you being here. Thanks for making the time.
Of course, of course. Thanks everyone for having me. Quick note, Ray. I think if people do want to chat, the chat is turned off for them, just as a heads up. So, just in
Uh,
case you want to drop some notes in the
sure.
chat later.
Yes,
Uh,
I will fix that and make sure that moving forward, people can answer questions. Thank you for doing that.
cool, 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 cool. No worries. Hey everyone, my name's Jimmy. I'm an RBS 2013, which is many more years than I was expecting to be saying ago. Super excited to be here. Like Ray mentioned, I'm going to be wearing a couple different hats. The first one I'm going to talk about is a company I started about 2 years ago called Simple IEP. A little bit of background, and if you're here for both presentations, you're going to have to hear it twice. But a little bit of background about me. My mom's been a special education teacher since I was 0. She started when I was born. She was at the same school. She taught middle school, which is a particularly rough grade, I would say, to teach special education. I feel like I was her guinea pig throughout those years to try to understand how she can try new strategies with her students or understand how they learn differently. I remember doing like when we would take road trips, I would be getting like little math games in the car, or she'd be like bribing me with M&Ms or all of these different things. Anyway, so that's where I'm coming to from today. I think a few years ago, I was working with a friend and we realized that, AI was coming. We realized that LLMs were really good at certain things and not so good at others. So, for example, they were great at working with lots of big and unstructured data. They weren't so great at not making things up. They were great at helping people understand things, but they weren't so great at like coming up with new ideas. They were great at checking work and like just making sure you didn't miss anything. And so we were kind of talking for a little bit. And, I was thinking about it and I was like, the thing my mom complains about most in all of her years of teaching is the paperwork, right? She's been working with students, she's been working with challenging families. She, has her wins and her losses in assessment or in academics or in behavior and things like that. But the thing that like really drove her nuts was on Thursday night when she had 5 different documents that were due the next day and she had to spend a few hours on each of them. And so we kind of had this idea where what if we could use AI to take a lot of the grunt work out of IEPs? For people who don't know what IEPs are, they're individualized education programs or plans. They're a federally mandated document that every student that is in the special education system has. And so that's about 1 in 6 right now, and it's growing across the US. So I think many, many millions of students. They're incredible. It's like one of my favorite things about education because it's kind of a right that I don't think would be given today, but is something that's been enshrined and protected for a while. One of the problems is that they can be anywhere from 10 pages to 100 pages long. They're written in language that is really hard to understand, and they're kind of placed on top of people's plates. So normally special education teachers, but also general education teachers, admins, directors, everyone kind of touches them at some point, and they're really just a tough thing to work through when you've got a ton of other pressing problems to do. So we were thinking, how can we solve or at least make this problem a lot easier? But at the same time, how do we make sure the teachers don't lose sight of what's in the document or what they're writing in the document, right? Because the other thing we don't want to do is we don't want to just say, hey, we're going to generate a chat. You guys probably at this point all received a chat GPT document that didn't make any sense. We didn't want that to happen. And so we've been working on a tool called Simple IEP for the past couple years. I'll show it in just a second, but basically, just so you know, I'll get to the punchline now. We've gone from 0 schools to about 8 schools, where we're now like working with them on a contracting basis. They're paying us money, working with almost 100 teachers and probably 1,000 students, which has been really fun. It's great because it's just me and a co-founder. I think also benefits of AI, you can build things really, really fast and with less people than you could before. And so we don't have to worry about like answering to funding needs other than our own. We don't have to worry about mixed up incentives there. We can really just kind of take our time and do some serious co-design with schools. So I'll share my screen and you guys can see a brief look at what this platform looks like. A couple things I'll note is, we've got this system, we've got this student. One of the things we hear a lot is, I've got a million documents about the student. What we don't have, or what we are not missing in education is data and documentation about students. Now, is it the right data and is it in the right place? That's a different question. But do we have data? Do we have documentation? Yes, we've got progress monitoring data. We've got state testing data. We've got grade reports. We've got parent notes. We've got initial evaluations, all of these different things. And for people who are not super close to special education or to education in general, these are just, imagine everything you've ever done has been documented somewhere. We've got that. And the problem is when it comes time to write this report, what do you do with all of that information? How do you work with it? And so in this specific case, we said, we don't want to worry about writing APIs with, student information systems or learning management systems yet. I think we're working towards that now. But one of the problems is they're not always up to date, so we can't always make the right connections there. We also hear from teachers all the time that like, oh, it's supposed to be here, but it doesn't work or it doesn't talk to the system well. So instead, we say teachers just go find every document that you've ever written about the student that might be important for this IEP. Go find it and upload it. So you just can go through, you can upload your different documents. They all come in. You can come across as different forms. It can be Word documents, PDFs, Google Sheets, pictures. We get handwritten notes sometimes. We get audio files, whatever it is. Like, let's dump it in here. And then we're going to start actually building a corpus of knowledge about the student, right? Because once we start getting all of this information, we can start sorting it. We can start understanding, okay, what should be attached to which pieces of learning, what the goals for the student might be, how they all might be related to things like present levels of educational performance, right? We can start adding data back measures, all these things that we know are important and we care about, but teachers are really, they just don't have the time or expertise to do a lot of the time. We can do that really easily with AI, especially when we have good sources of truth. I'll also mention this is all like FERPA compliant, HIPAA compliant. There's like a lot of stuff that goes into that. So there's a student privacy piece to this too. And then there's also how do we do data traceability and data security to make sure that the things that are getting generated, which we'll see in a second, are true and correct and are based on real data. Anyway, I'll just show you a quick example. So here, I've uploaded a career survey. You can see it's got checkboxes and things like that. This is the raw file that gets uploaded. We process this right away. We do different types of processing for different types of files. But basically, again, the goal is the easiest thing for teachers to do and upload? Let's dump it in and start writing reports. And so we mainly do IEPs, but we also do things like behavior plans, progress reporting, quarterly reports, parent notes, things like that. So one of the kind of cool things about our system is we work individually with every school to customize the template that they use because every state has a different way of doing IEPs. Every district within every state, for the most part, has a different way of doing IEPs within that district because they're all sensitive to different things. They're all worried about compliance risks in different areas. And they've also all got different data sources. So when we onboard with the school, we have a pretty cool way of creating specific IEPs to that school so it'll match the IEP template that the schools have one-to-one. And then we get started. So we can create a draft. Once we jump into the draft, you'll see it's just a lot of different ways to input data and kind of scan through this. gets really boring. I kind of like the boring projects because this is the stuff that imagine, it's boring to see to potentially, but it's really, really boring to fill out 5, 10 times a year for those special education teachers. We can do a couple different things. So we have an autofill button. One really important thing, the autofill button only autofill stuff that we don't think the teacher needs to think about. So for example, the like date of birth, their like student ID, that kind of stuff, we can take care of that information for the IEP. For everything else, we actually require a lot of teacher input. So as you move through, you'll see a few different things that go through. So eligibility statement is also a pretty straightforward piece because it doesn't change from year to year. You can see we're actually using a couple things in this. We've got the name, we've got some instructions for the teacher. This is also really helpful for your new teacher. And then we actually have templates that get filled out. And these templates are like AI templates. They're not, the traditional like fill in the blank templates. And so this allows it to be a lot more flexible, but still pretty targeted to what the district is looking for and the way that they want to write their IEPs. It gets a lot more interesting when we get into the present levels of educational performance. This is where we can do a couple different things, and we actually ask for a lot of teacher input into the data. So for every need that a student has within special education, um, the teacher is supposed to be filling out different pieces of information about it. So their current performance, their strengths, their needs. And this is where we say, hey, teachers, we really need you to guide what we're going to do. And so the other thing we learned is that teachers don't like to type. They do a lot of work every day. Normally they're trying to finish all their work at the end of the day or, in between periods. And oftentimes they just like don't feel like writing an essay. But they're really good at updating other teachers on what's going on. So one of the things we're trying to do too is we're trying to figure out how do we imitate the way a teacher would naturally tell teachers about the student. So we've got some voice activated features, and also how can they do this in natural language rather than in this like very specific language that IEPs require. I'll do this really quickly. Adrian is really struggling with reading comprehension. He's not able to understand main ideas or themes, and he can't use supporting text to kind of like relate to the main theme. Okay, so you saw I was going very fast, but that's little input from the voice activated features. I'm going to drive the AI need. So it's really what is the loop between AI, teachers, and the data that's going to give the best information. So I said a little bit of things, and then the AI is actually going to go sort through all of the information we've uploaded and then create these longer form, more bulleted things. Teachers will click on it, fully editable. Obviously, the teacher is in control. And this is where we really get that kind of synergy that I think is really important for teachers. Last thing I'll talk about are goals for anyone who's in the education space. They know that this is often the Achilles heel. There's a lot of reasons for this, but it ends up going to core. It's like the way that you're actually going to provide these services to students. So we do a couple things. Same kind of thing. We can do voice activated features. We can do some guesses and making it better, but we can also suggest different goals based on all of the different needs. So here you saw it's going to suggest 3 different goals to me that are actually tied to the information we know about the student and the needs that the teacher has provided. This is really great for new teachers. It also goes into a format. So for people who know it's like these are normally SMART goals, although sometimes they're ABCD plus T goals. And this becomes really important for compliance reasons again. I'm going to stop there because I'm probably talking your ear off. There's a lot of other cool features, but really what we made is just a really big form filler that's supposed to solve complicated and tedious jobs for teachers, but at the same time providing extra data, things that teachers might miss otherwise. Uh, I will say, like we've found, it's all about the process. It's all about figuring out how to provide instant value. Yeah, we're excited to just kind of keep working, keep growing.
Awesome, Jimmy. Thank you for that, and I appreciate you coming back again to talk about Simple IEP. Quick question for you while Sean gets things set up for him. Tell me a bit more about how you guys are approaching building the company itself. You are not looking to raise a bunch of money and grow and be in every classroom by next week. I know you have a lot of quality reasons for that too, but can you provide any insight for other folks who might be thinking that they want to build an ed tech company about the different way that you're approaching it than the company building that makes all the headlines right now?
Yeah, if I had to guess and take this for a grain of salt because the company is again, we're growing, we're getting a little bit bigger, but we're not like super successful or anything yet. So, take whatever you will from that. One of the things I've been hearing from schools, and I think as we get more and more vendors pop up, schools are more and more wary of tools. I mean, I'll talk about this later, but like we're in tool fatigue hell, basically. Of there's so many different things. They don't talk to each other. All these AI companies, right? Like anyone can pop up an AI startup within a week if they wanted to. So it's really about how do we figure out that we're solving the right problems? How do we form deep partnerships with schools where they know, like the schools I work with, I'm not saying that this is sustainable or scalable, but like they have my number. So if something goes wrong or if they have a question, they text me, right? Or they email me. I can hop on a call. I can show up the next day on a Zoom call. It's really, really easy. So I think that trust piece, that how do we solve the problem in a way that the school is already ready for? Like in the work I'm doing, and one of the things that I think we've kind of nailed is everything we do is really customizable, right? So it's pretty bespoke to each school. So now instead of a school having to change the way that they write IEPs or change the, workflows that they have that take a lot of time and education, produce pushback from teachers or systems, we can, figure out how we fit into those workflows, which I think makes a big difference. Now, how do we think about scale? One of the things we've done is we've, offloaded a lot of that customization process. So if we're offering a custom solution to a school, that means we have to do the customization, which is normally where scale hurts. But what we've done is that's where we leverage AI on the customization piece. So instead of pushing, I mean, we do AI with the schools, obviously, but instead of pushing quite as much AI on the school side, we actually push a lot of it on our side to support us in creating these custom templates and creating different ways to work with schools, accommodating different workflows, thinking about things like how do we connect with school systems. That's what we've been doing. We also, I mean, schools are, I think learning is communal. I think it's really about relationships. You learn best from people that you care about. I think it's the same with us, where our schools are our partners. They talk to other schools about us. We're working on how do we go from a school to a district in a way that doesn't scare anyone, especially when we're working with some of the most sensitive students and data. That's really important.
Right. Yeah, well said. I can see that, that certainly you're working on a product that you hope can reach a lot of people, but even in the customizations and design partnerships, AI helping you do something that normally you wouldn't have the bandwidth to do or couldn't do as well or at scale or as quickly gets you, I think, to the end destination that you and your schools want, even better, and so that's awesome. A lot more. We can chat on it. Maybe when you give your presentation, we can kind of do a dual Q&A of simple IEP as well as your research. But for the time being, I'm going to pass it over to Sean, and then Jimmy, I'll bring you back here in a second. Sean, thank you so much for being here. So Sean is 2017 captain, not just in his capacity for with talking about the research that he's been doing at Columbia today, but he's a founder. He is a consultant, ex-consultant. He is, I don't know, so many different hats. I'm sure in he probably wouldn't go as far as to give himself the title of software engineer, but I'm sure there are very few things that he hasn't tinkered with or tried to build, or at least assembled the team to do so. So when I think about the archetype of the type of person that could go on to build and do anything with his time and his talents, but that we're grateful that he's choosing to focus it on education, Sean is at the top of that list. So Sean, thank you for being here, and for sharing a little bit about what you've been doing at Columbia. I'm going to give you the floor. You've got your 10 minutes. You let me know if you need anything or help with that. A quick thing that I'll just say for everybody else: I don't really know why or how the chat function isn't working, but I realize that I can allow folks to ask live questions with your voice, like you can unmute yourself. And so I think if you use the raise your hand feature throughout the talk, I can figure out how to make sure to get your question to you. But my apologies for the chat. I'm not functioning properly. But anyway, Sean, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for the introduction and the space, as always, Ray. I'm glad to be here today amongst, a bunch of other amazing speakers. Congratulations to Jimmy on the growth since the AI Summit. I think you were in one or two schools at the time, so it's amazing to see you grow the platform out over a pretty short period of time. As you said, I'm Sean, Ron Brown captain, went to Stanford undergrad masters, and studied education policy in my master's program, which has now led me to join the Center for Educational Equity as a researcher, program manager, really thinking through the intersection between democracy and schools. How can we solve problems better by getting more people involved? That question has really pushed us to create a process and an accompanying platform to meaningfully engage as many people as possible in large public school settings, which I'll flip through some pages and show you all about today. So we call the process outreach. And the core question is really how can we improve learning outcomes and overall quality of life and budget efficiency by including more people in school policy decisions? The first question you may be thinking, how are people not included in school policy decisions? And it's very interesting, one, to note how much money we're talking about in a lot of contexts here. On the left, you see the 5 largest public school districts in the country and the billions of dollars that are under management from the tax space, the public tax space that gets distributed. But there's this interesting thing where, as Dr. Stewart mentioned, everyone in leadership has to have a PhD. Most of them have been teachers before. They've been really given their lives to service. So it's this small body of stressed, resource constrained people making the best decisions, often on the fly, that they can, which can result in some bad outcomes. One such bad outcome, one of the most famous examples, is called the largest EdTech failure in history, happened in the LAUSD school district in 2013. The superintendent at the time, great idea, very visionary idea, wanted to give every single kid an iPad. This was before the one-to-one schools movement. This is before all of this. Struck this deal with Apple, push it all the way through, but missed some very simple, finer points of implementation that caused the whole thing to fail. They gave up after maybe 6 months of implementation. The guy got fired. Hundreds of millions of dollars got wasted. So really, we've created this platform to try to help school boards, superintendents, school board leaders involve as many people in large scale school reform as possible to cut down on the waste that can occur from assumptions. So that thing happening in the LAUSD school district was the backdrop of my professor's PhD study at UCLA. His premise as a researcher for the last 15 years has been very simple. The more people you involve, the better the outcomes are, the better attendance is, the better grades are, and the higher quality the entire environment is. When kids know that their parents are paying attention, they're more diligent. When parents participate together, they get to know each other, the community bonds become stronger. They start voting more in local elections. There's some really amazing trickle-down effects. And that work has caused him to go from Brown to Columbia. And now in his third year at Columbia, he's been named the head of the Center for Educational Equity. And he's just been named to the school board, the largest public school board in the country, in charge of the education of some 1.3 million kids. And you just saw it earlier, just shy of $40 billion. But there's two very large problems stopping this kind of inclusive framework from really taking off, particularly in New York and other cities around the country as well. The first is that more input requires more structure, right? The more qualitative data you have for anything, the harder it is to decode that data and to work with it. And you can create some very political, inflammatory moments when people are just speaking with no guardrails. On the right, you see a New York headline, a New York Times headline from a professor saying something insane on a school board meeting. But the way that people participate now is school board meetings. Once a month here in New York, they get together and these meetings go for 5+ hours, not an exaggeration. We've had meetings go from 6 p.m. to 2 in the morning. And because of this is the evening time. These are working class folks. These are parents. Less than 1% of parents are actually getting engaged with policy. So the school board meetings become this battleground of ideas and emotions and, just wanting desperately to have your voice heard, as opposed to a collaborative space where people can come together and really understand what's happening and do something different for the benefit of the entire community. So that's the first problem. More parent input just requires a lot of structure. And the second is New York is incredibly diverse and siloed, right? There's 150 languages spoken in this city, 9 languages required to be translated for any NYC, DOE, curriculum, anything like that. 40% of students speak more than one language, and 20% of parents do not speak fluent English. The 20% is conservative, right? So you have a situation where, again, 1.2 million kids, so what is that? 2.5 million parents have never been able to have a real conversation together about anything, much less their children's education in the future and what needs to change in a very bureaucratic system. So to address those two things, we've created, the outreach framework, right? We really want to emphasize the tech is a vehicle for a process, and the process is a very simple, human-centered design feedback loop. You ask people to participate. You make participation as easy as possible. You use tools to augment that participation, translation, summarization, etc. And then you let the people you see participated see you do something about that, right? I spent my time participating in a small group discussion, and then I watched the school leadership actually do something based off of my recommendations. And as time goes on, at some point, the easy problems are going to be handled. You can get more and more innovative and start to think about reform when there's basic trust in the system, which I think in our political climate has eroded a little bit. So that's really what we're trying to do here: create the largest feedback loop possible and make it as accessible as we can for parents to participate in these policy discussions about where their taxpayer dollars go for their kids' education. We've done a little bit of research on this process as researchers. Some amazing preliminary results. We've had more than 100 people touch the platform. Ran about 40 parents through a real IRB approved research process, and we'll be finishing that out this summer with another 100 parents. We've seen, parents 20% more confident discussing policy issues in the first place, and 40% more likely to join discussions after, we did the research with them. So walking them through this process, having them take part in these smaller group discussions gives them a lot of confidence and excitement to participate because they realize that, what's being discussed is accessible, is something that they can meaningfully contribute to. For the tech side of things, how we make this scalable, we're really focused on the following features here. Uh, Collaborative decision making, everyone talking in a shared space, automated synthesis of that conversation, being able to moderate the conversation to keep the conversation safe. You can't say anything that's not PG, you can't say anything that's too off topic. Training moderators to work in these small group settings to allow people to have good conversations. And translation. How do we allow anyone, regardless where they're from, to show up and be able to contribute critically by using some of the latest tools to do live translation? On the right, you see kind of some of the mobile shots of the platform with some of what the summaries look like with this key kind of next steps button here. So say you walk someone through a 20-minute conversation, the next step is for them to vote. The next step is for them to sign up to volunteer. The next step is for them to register for a thing. You can kind of put that call to action right there after the conversation. Here's what the moderation looks like. Everyone's broken out into these 8 to 12 person breakout rooms. You have people just conversating naturally. And if for any reason someone says something negative, and a moderator, a human moderator, can take a look at that comment and, okay, anyone who needs homework in this instance is stupid. Sandy, why would you say that? I can suggest a rephrase. We can just delete it and act like it didn't happen. We can kick her out of the forum immediately, or we can just let the message slide because the moderation picked it up and it wasn't that big of a deal. So what's next for us? We've been using it and testing it locally. It's gone pretty well. We've been piloting it in a few schools here in Harlem. And next, we're working on a UN partnership with the youth office, which they define youth as like 14 to 24 or something like that, to be able to train young people on how to moderate policy conversations and really accelerate their own grassroots organizing as UN youth delegates through access to the platform. And we're seeking some funders to help us out with that work. So that's the long and short of it. Would love to answer any questions, but for us, it's really about how do you make people feel as though uh, they really belong through being inclusive in policy design, right? Like we envision a future where, it's not so simple as what is going to get kids reading on grade level, but like what do we need to include in the classroom environment to prepare them for the future, and then having a conversation with students and parents all at once on being able to create solutions together.
Yeah, that's awesome, Sean. Thank you for this. I'll ask you one quick question and see if anybody raises their hand and wants to ask you one real quick briefly. You are somebody who could be using AI to do a lot of things in the world. Why have you chosen to focus on reimagining what a democratic process around something as important as schools? Why do this instead of build enterprise software or some other cute app that other people want to use? Other people are in your seat making similar decisions. You've made some tough ones. Can you share a little bit about why you are where you are now and what you're excited about related to that?
Yeah, I think, and I wrote this down during Dr. Stewart's session, isomorphism,
Yeah.
the tendency for something not to change. This, you can also call it the status quo and, in Latin terms, I think that's Latin. Uh, but yeah, I don't know. So I'm from Ferguson, Missouri originally, right? And a lot of my youth, high school was spent organizing, gathering voice together to try to make changes meaningfully. And to resist isomorphism, to resist the status quo, you have to be very organized, right? You have to create a common streamlined voice that feels comprehensive, that doesn't feel anecdotal, you have to really do research to make your case to create any substantial change. Because the barrier to create change in our society is high. I think it's just a part of human nature. So when it comes to me, My opinion on where we're at with AI is that like most of the low hanging fruit has been plucked, and
Yeah.
all of the very easy things to do with AI, or like widely applicable, have been solved pretty well by a large enterprise SaaS company that already had some type of data moat or an army of engineers to be able to do it. And what we're left with are very niche things that maybe a lot of people don't care about, but could be very valuable to a small set of people, or complex things, right? Hard issues,
Right.
things that require a little bit more finesse and a human touch to solve, as opposed to just being able to, I don't know, Salesforce AI agents is really just like a search function on your own internal documents in the cloud, right? So for me, thinking through the fact that I've been using AI every day for the last 6 years before it was even released to the public, what should I do with that? Let's focus on the largest, hardest problems I can get my hands on,
Yeah.
and see where we can really go with that.
Yeah. Well said, and glad you're doing it. And I know that you'll continue to inspire a lot of folks to follow behind you. What's the best way for us to keep up with you? I don't know if your email was email might have been on the last slide. Is that best ways for people to keep up to, or LinkedIn, or what would you prefer?
Yeah, the email's there. I think we're trying to do more of our own storytelling for the center. So it's the Center for Educational Equity at Columbia University.
Yeah.
Those two ways are fantastic, and
Good.
just appreciative of anyone who wants to learn more about what we're doing and see if, any sort of social enterprise that they're working on, you want to have a large scale conversation, and pull in as many stakeholders as you can.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Sean. This is great as always, and looking forward to for us to catch up as well as for continuing the success you guys have been having with that so far. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. So we are going to give the spotlight back to Jimmy to put on his researcher hat and talk through the work that he has been doing. Sorry, let me just make sure that you have what you need here. Okay, I think you should be ready to share and to do all of that, Jimmy. I want to give I want to give both of you your flowers for one specific thing that I appreciate that you both done in tackling what Sean described as those complex, really tough problems. You both are talented enough and equipped with the right tools, as you said, could have built great products and companies over a weekend of using, Cloud Code, whatever tool that you had. You chose to pause to make sure that rigor and analysis is embedded in everything that you do rather than focusing on speed. And so as Ron Brown scholars and captains and alumni think about the end state of whatever it is that you want to build, I don't think we emphasize enough that a lot of that normally starts as research, starts as somebody in some sort of institution that is dedicated to executing things with proper methodology, with training, with guardrails, to making sure that you're doing things the right way, not just doing something just because you can. Even AI itself was born a lot of that ethos, and we'll hope that it continues to hold that spirit of its origin too. So just want to thank you both for not just creating things that could be cool, but making sure that you're doing it the right way and consulting experts and using the research enterprise that we have to make it even better. So I think we need a lot more builders who also are willing to go do that too. So Jimmy, take it away, and then yeah, super excited to hear more about the other hat that you wear, and hopefully you get some sleep amidst all of these things too. But I know it's a busy.
Yeah, no, cool. Thank you, Ray. And Sean, what a cool project they are working on. I mean, always fun to see. Not fun, so important to see the community engagement piece. And just again, I said this before, but I think education and learning is communal. And so anytime we can bring in parents, teachers, students, community members together, we're going to have better outcomes. Okay, totally different hat. To Ray's point, what sleep do I get? I'm not sure. My graduate school advisor told me to always have multiple jobs, and so I'm really trying to take that advice to heart. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the research part of the work that I do at an organization called Assessment for Good. One other confusing thing is Assessment for Good is turning into Aluko Learning, so I might use them interchangeably. They're the same thing, at least in what we do. Assessment for Good was just a 4-year research project that we're wrapping up now. So I'll skip most of this, but just a little bit of background in case people are curious about like different paths that you can take. I started out studying mechanical engineering at MIT. So how did I end up in education? Well, probably because of my mom, but also through a very like winding and circuitous path. I also, I think just from an early age, I like really loved education, right? I loved school, I loved learning, I loved being around other people. I thought it was so meaningful and important. And the older I get, the more important I think it is to build better society and just help make sure that everyone has a somewhat fair shot. I will say that being said, right now and from time immemorial, education has not been fair, although we're working on it. We're trying to make it more fair. Okay. Quick overview. We're going to talk about some of the things that we're finding at Assessment for Good, three problem spaces that we're specifically working in, what we're learning with our 10,000 student study that we're running this year, uh, and then maybe a quick preview of the tools that we're building, depending on time. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, first, what are some of the things that we're seeing at Assessment for Good? I should mention I'm the Associate Director of Emerging Technologies, whatever that means. Basically, it just means I think through some of the foundational research that we've been doing and how we might apply it or partner with other orgs to have impact for our students and teachers. So I'm going to share some of the things that I've been hearing from our teachers, district leaders that we've partnered with, and then ultimately the students. So first off, everyone's got problems with education. I think again, for the people in this call, this is probably no surprise, but teachers are overworked, they're stressed, they're out of time, and they're really living in this like fragmented world with weird things that they have to account for, right? I mean, we have to teach to a test because testing is so important and reflects so much on them. But at the same time, those don't always overlap with learning goals. We're also asking them to do more and more things because now not only are you teaching, you're also being a counselor, you're also working with families, you're also building curriculum, you're doing so many different things. It's really, really tiring. On the community side, school leaders, to district leaders, parents, family, they're really wondering right now what actually works. I won't name any names, but we've seen some headlines come out recently, especially in the ed tech space, about some pretty popular programs and curriculum types that don't seem to have the efficacy or evidence behind them that we thought that they did in the past. In addition, schools have vendor fatigue. So they're seeing more and more startups and also just old time vendors come through. They're, you know, losing funding pretty rapidly, not only kind of because of federal policy, but also because of the ending of COVID relief funds called ESSER funding. They're really stressed about how they're going to pay their bills, how they're going to pay their teachers, how they're going to continue to have the software services and programs that will support their students. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of screen backlash. This is kind of related to, the evidence-based thing, but I think with AI and with more and more digital tools coming into the classroom, people are wondering if that's the right move. Finally, on the student side, they're saying that school feels really irrelevant, right? It's not related to what they're seeing today. I think when the school system was set up, it was really built for standardization and it was kind of set up a long time ago, and we've done the best that we can, but it doesn't always reflect what they're seeing outside of the classroom. At the same time, the world is changing faster than ever, probably faster than the adults can keep up with it. And so, what is a student supposed to do and a kid supposed to do when they see that happening? Finally, they're worried about jobs. They're worried about life after. They're worried about what are they going to do? What is there going to be to do? And there's no clear path like there used to be, right? I think we're seeing the erosion as well, not completely, but to some degree of go to college, get a good job, live a middle class life. Okay, so the result, and this looks a little doom and gloom, and it's a gross simplification. But the nation's report card shows pretty much all across the board long-term falling educational trends. That's not good. This is a lot of down arrows. We're scared about that. So what can we do about it? At Assessment for Good, we're working in three different areas. And so I'll talk a little bit about what those different areas are and where we think we can pull these unique levers and why we're working in these specific areas. So the first thing we're thinking about, and we'll go into these a little bit more, is momentary learning readiness. So there's this example of, when a student shows up on a Monday, we don't know what they did over the weekend. We don't know what they're bringing in. We don't know if they ate. We don't know if they had a fight with their sibling. We don't know if they had a great weekend and went to Disneyland and are so excited to tell their friends. All we know is what they tell us or what we can see. And that can be really tough because if, one student, maybe you could figure it out. But if you're a classroom teacher and you've got 20 students coming in on a Monday, uh, you don't know what's happening for most of them. And it's actually very time consuming to figure that out. And then also the student doesn't always know. Kind of, I always think students are basically just adults in little bodies. That's not 100% true, but a lot of it is true. Like, we don't always know what we're feeling. We don't always know what we're thinking about. We don't always know if we're stressed or tired or hungry. Students also don't always know that. And we also know that depending on what a student is carrying in the state that they're in, they may be more or less ready to learn. Second thing, teacher tools with AI. This is related to some of the simple IEP work that I was talking about. But basically, there's no time. How can we help teachers and leverage AI in a way that makes sense and doesn't take control away from them or doesn't replace the types of things that they want to do well, and then also doesn't make their job harder? And finally, and this is kind of the most abstract, visionary, future thinking stuff, and also maybe some of the most interesting. But what are the foundational skills and individualized pathways of learning that each student can take? So, kind of the probing question that we always ask is, if we could map the learning DNA of every student, what would a truly individual path for them look like? Or, if we talk about individualization and differentiation, what could that actually mean? Not today, but in 10 years from now or in a few years from now. So, starting off with momentary learning readiness, I kind of mentioned this, but every student is showing up to school carrying something a little bit different. And we also know, or we believe, I guess I should call it a theory, but one of the, predominant learning theories around the zone of proximal development, stuff like that, is around how do we actually think about how learning happens? And I think Dr. Stewart, you were talking about something very similar here, but the way we define it, which I think overlaps really, really clearly with you, is what is the intersection of instruction, environment, and skills for a student? So the instruction from the teacher, the environment of learning that they're in, and the state that they're carrying, and then also their foundational skills, right? So what does the student already know? What does that intersection look like? Because if we can get to that intersection, we can really start to understand if a student is ready to learn in the moment on that Monday morning, or after lunch on a Thursday afternoon. Another thing is readiness isn't a trait, right? So this is the momentary part. So throughout the day, the way that a learner feels, the way that a learner is engaging with the work, the way that a learner is interacting with the people around them will change. It can change and it will change. And so it's not just about Monday morning, but again, it might be about Thursday afternoon. It might be about after they have like a little blow up with a teacher, whatever that might be. That readiness throughout the day might change. And can we start to think about those patterns, understand what that means for their learning? And finally, just kind of the hypothesis or the question that we have is, how might we help every student learn their best today? And how might we help teachers read the room and move it so that their students are most ready to learn? Okay. The second problem space we're working in, I covered this on the simple IP stuff, so I'll be super quick, but just basically teacher tools. So like, again, where can we take away some of the burden that the teachers have? And then finally, what are the foundational skills and individualized pathways? So the current way school is set up is kind of based on this subject mastery idea. So something like reading comprehension or algebra 1 or math fluency, right? There's these standards that we have, and we expect students to kind of move through these standards in a fairly linear path. What's kind of interesting is, and I think we're seeing some of the rub right now, is these skills don't always align with what it takes to make it, whatever that is. And there's lots of different definitions, right? Like, what is a learner-centered definition of make it, but what it takes to make it in the world today. So how can we think about what the future skills are? So things like durable skills, 21st century skills, all of these different things that we've talked about for a while, but haven't really figured out a standard definition and way to measure. How can we start thinking about these, measure them, and then hopefully leverage different strategies to change them and map out individual pathways based on durable skills? So instead of thinking through reading comprehension as a linear path, how can we start thinking through how students might move through those if we knew their specific learning genome and individualized curriculum, learning, instructional time for them specifically? Okay. I'm going to skip some of the interaction pieces just because of where we are. And then I will go through, okay, how we're working and what we're learning. So a little bit of background about Assessment for Good and Aluko Learning. So we're originally an R&D program that is very focused on assessments and novel types of assessments on kind of the younger end of the student spectrum. So ages 8 through 13 are about grades 3 through 8. This is like a big transitionary period, really important for development, and it's where a lot of these skills start to show up in ways that are really unique, and that's why we're focused there. You mentioned a little bit about this already, but most current assessment, so think like a star reading test or a state assessment, is measuring subject mastery. And subject mastery is not always that helpful because if you have teacher, or if you have a student who you're teaching like a reading comprehension standard to and you're implementing the curriculum with fidelity, but the teacher or the student is not doing very well, you don't always know why that is. It might be because they need more instructional time, but it also might be for a million other different reasons. It might be that they didn't eat lunch that morning or that afternoon. It might be because they're lacking the ability to engage with the work or they feel out of place at school. It might be because they're missing the ability to initiate ideas on their own. There's lots of different things it could be, and it's really hard to tell what those things are. So one of our big goals is how can we, in an asset-based way, uncover the skills that students use to power all types of learning? So instead of thinking about subject domains kind of in isolation, how do we start thinking about the underlying skills like initiation, like engagement, like agency that power all types of different learning? And then how do we get those data insights to teachers and students so that they can take control of the learning? We are finishing up our fourth year of research, which is the final year of our research. And we are working with almost 10,000 or about 10,000 students across the nation in a big IRB study, and they're predominantly Black and Brown. So just to call out that a lot of the students that we work with and the ways that these constructs have been defined on the research side have been with different types of students. And so we think that these skills are showing up differently in different populations. And we want to make sure that all students are represented and that particularly the Black and Brown students who might not have gotten the same representation in the past are now getting represented in this data set. We follow an inclusive research and development model. So our founder, Dr. Temple Lovelace, you should definitely go check her out. She's really cool. She pioneered this emancipatory R&D model, but basically it's how do you really work with communities in a way that makes sense and benefits everyone and isn't just, oh, yeah, we like talk to them one time, right? And so we have learning councils, we have regular touch points with students and teachers, we have feedback mechanisms within our schools. We pay our students, or we pay our teachers, I should say, and some of our students, depending on what they're doing, for their work with us. There's a lot of different ways that we're trying to give back and make this a bilateral relationship because we also know that what we're doing is valuable to us and to the knowledge base of academia and industry. So how can we make sure that kind of trying to share some of that value with the partners that we're working with and also giving them agency and some drive in what we're doing. Okay, cool. So getting to the stuff that we're learning. So we found 6 core areas or 6 skill families of learner development that we've been able to say, these are real, they are measurable, and they make a difference in a learner's life. And so those 6 skill areas are agency, engagement, 2 types of executive function, internal and relational, metacognition, and learning time. So within each of these skill areas, there's somewhere between 3 and 5 skills that kind of create the skill area. But the idea of the skill area is these skill groups can move together. And so what that means is these skill groups, as they grow or shrink, tend to move in the same direction and can be used to leverage different types of learning. We've been finding some really interesting patterns about these skill areas. I'm going to get a little nerdy for the next few minutes. Someone can stop me if you want, but it's really exciting to me. So we do a lot of different types of scoring for our assessment platform. So basically, we're giving out tests to people that are engaging and kind of relational for those students, and then we're getting data back, and then we're trying to figure out what does that data mean, how do we score it, all that good stuff. So some of the things we're learning about for our skill areas are one, the way the skill areas show up in grades 3 through 5 and 6 through 8 are quite different. And what that means or some of the specific ways are in grades 3 through 5, the way students what students are finding challenging in grades 6 and 3 through 5. So for example, students find let's see, learning time, somewhat challenging in grades 3 through 5. It's a little bit easier for them in grades 6 through 8. So as they're getting older, these different skill areas are actually changing in difficulty. Another thing that we're finding is in the younger grades, most of the skill areas tend to be bundled together. So if a learner goes up in one skill area, they tend to go up in all of them. But as they get older, those skill areas start to separate and differentiate. And so they don't always move together in the same way. And so, you know, measuring it becomes a little bit more challenging, but also a little bit more interesting because they start to differentiate. Another thing that we've seen is that we've kind of always assumed that these foundational skills, and especially essential skills within SEL, are shaped like a ladder. So, we would think that, oh, they would start at this low level and then they would kind of build on top of each other. And over time, there's this linear path where they're reaching more and more skill mastery. And moving towards, on the academic side, they start here and they kind of move up rung by rung. But what we're actually finding is that our skill progression isn't shaped like a ladder, but it's more of a terrain, right? And so students have different preferences and different ways to move up and down this terrain and figure out their path to learning and skill progression on these power skills. And so that's been really fun. It's been really interesting to see. I mean, it makes it really complicated about how you think about progression because at this point we're getting like super individualized. We're like trying to figure out how do you move up and down? What are the factors? What are the levers we can pull? But it's also cool that every student has different pathways to success. And also to credit all the teachers out there, all teachers know that, but we're proving it with the data. Uh, Another thing On the field side is from kind of the education, research, and philanthropy side. People are really interested in this concept called knowledge graphs, which is basically just a different way of thinking through learning progressions and how they're related to one another, or how you might move through them. And so we're working with a few of the bigger players, trying to use knowledge graphs and apply power skill principles to those. And so, how can we start thinking about Common Core standards as learning progressions with their learning components, and then what power skills map onto that as, so that we can start understanding how to individualize learning for students? There's a lot more to say about that. Happy to chat about it after. I think, Ray, am I done at 4? If so, I'll take a stop. I'll stop there.
You can, but if there's something you want us to see, I don't think anybody would mind if you have anything that you want to see.
Cool. I'll go super quickly. I'll just show you guys some of the tools. So we have been doing this big research study. I'll give you a quick preview of some of the tools that we've been showing to teachers and students. So this is one example of, on the research side, this is all, again, all sample data. This is a student's power skills compass is what we call it, but we start to see how some of these different skills cluster together and how teachers can understand learning and the different skills that students might have. So the ways teachers tend to use this is they tend to look at, we don't love this. There's different ways that we like to think about it. They tend to think, okay, what skills are my students low in? So in this case, sorry, I have to log back. In this case, they will see that a student might be low in something like, they might be low in something like academic mindset, right? So they can get a little bit more data about what that academic mindset is and what it means. But then we're also giving them strategies that can support students in growing their academic mindset. In addition to helping teachers support students in growing their academic mindset, teachers can also see what they're related to on the Common Core side. So what we're really trying to do is, how do we tie power skills and Common Core standards and practical instruction together so that everyone can kind of create the best learning environments possible? Last thing I'll show is just on the student side what they see, because it's kind of fun. We're still figuring out what it looks like for a student to interact with this stuff, because as you can tell, and from my very long explanation, it can get really complicated. And so we're trying to, capture this balance between simplicity and also just giving students, like treating students. Okay, well, maybe not. Sorry, guys. But what is this balance between treating students with respect and also just giving them enough agency to make their own decisions, but not overloading them with information? To that end, this is the results students see from the assessments that they take, and just some things that I'll highlight because it's been really exciting to see it develop. We've changed it like a bunch of times over the past few years, and students like it more and more every time. Students love to see qualitative labels about themselves, and so this really is also a great way to use asset-based framing to make sure that students feel like they are able to actually make sense of what their learning means and what their profile of learning means. We show them different skill areas. So these are all simplified versions in terms of language around those different skill areas I talked about, like agency is equal to doing, engaging is equal to engaging, etc. So they can see information about that and also the work that they've done towards that skill. They get a little bit of information about the work that they've done here via cards. And then we've also just introduced, these are one of my favorite parts. They're called pattern cards, and they're where we start to introduce things around the learning progressions and skill areas that are a little bit more nuanced and kind of show pattern level data rather than just like flat assessment data. Finally, they get some strategies too, so they can support their different skill areas. Okay, I'll stop there. But thank you so much for all the time. Happy to chat anytime about all of this stuff. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of really cool research and stuff that is just really fun. I think it's going to come out in the next few years, and it'll be cool to see.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for going through that and doing so concisely with the limited time I gave you. I can see how, even though you're wearing multiple hats and doing a lot of different things, that both hats feed into each other and can inspire one another. And I can see a lot of overlap in why you're interested in both things. So thank you so much, man, for being here, for your 2 for 2 in terms of presenters at the AI Summit of knocking it out of the park. So I really appreciate it. What is the best way for folks to keep up with you and what you're doing? Maybe LinkedIn or something, since I know you'll probably have many email addresses, many things that you're always checking. What's the best place for people to do that?
Yeah. LinkedIn's normally the easiest. It's probably the most reliable. My emails are on the internet somewhere, and also you can find them on the LinkedIn profile too. Mm, So,
Yeah. Okay. Awesome, Jimmy. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
of course, thank you.
All right. We are going to shift to our next session with an extremely special individual to who I owe a lot. Not only is Mike Woodward a scholar and an educator, a nonprofit leader, and now works in philanthropy, he is an educator that if I think across all of the ones that I had, particularly in non-traditional settings, I think influenced the trajectory of my personal life in a big way. He was the first person to tell me about the Ron Brown Scholar Program. We met when he was, yeah, I guess still teaching. Yeah, you were Kennedy's teacher. Yeah, so you were teaching high school. We met in the mountains of Colorado, where I think both of us felt a bit out of place. Me a little less so, being from not too far away, but still hadn't spent much time at Aspen. Made sure that I saw something in myself at that time that I didn't know about yet, and that is that over a decade later that I would be not just a part of this community, but helping to bring more raisin mics into the fold and make sure that they're getting on their way. So I say thank you every time we talk. There's nothing but thank you I have. One day I will return the favor to you. But until then, thank you again for making the time to be here to talk a little bit about your work. So I want to just kind of recap a little bit for the audience of what we've done so far today. So we started with Ryan Stewart talking about just kind of the landscape of education and how you can think about where you want to fit into that as a change agent. And he not all that different than your background. Spent time in the classroom, spent time in schools, spent time in nonprofits, certainly spent time in engaging with philanthropists, spent time in policy and kind of walked us through that. We then shifted over the last maybe hour or so talking to folks who are actively building with technology and research on the frontier of education. Jimmy started with talking about the company and AI tool that he has for students who have IEPs and automating a lot of the back end paperwork to make things easier for students and parents and educators. Then we had Sean talk about the research of what he's doing, leveraging AI for school boards and making the democratic process of education better and more accessible. And that if you want more voices to be involved in the conversation, you can't necessarily use the same tools and infrastructure to do that. You need new structures in order to make sure that people can meaningfully participate well. And then we had Jimmy come back again to talk about the research that he's doing in assessments and the tools that they're building to help connect standards and skills and students and teachers. And there's a player in the background that we haven't directly talked about yet that certainly makes a lot of research and innovation possible, that certainly does a lot of advocacy on the policy side, which is philanthropy. And so like, thank you so much for being here and would love to give you the floor. Maybe we'll start just a little about you giving a bit about your background and talking about the work that you're doing now. And then I've just got some larger questions about how you see the role of philanthropy in education and how we might think about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, one, Ray, it's always a pleasure to be in space with you, even dating back more than a decade. So when you were between your junior and senior year of high school, I remember our conversations pretty vividly. And, I'm so proud of you. And to your point around one day you'll pay me back, you pay me back by paying it forward, right? And there were so many people who invested in me, which I'm sure is true for so many Ron Brown scholars, where you're never quote unquote able to pay folks back, but you do it by paying folks forward. So it's odd. I can't see who's on the call. That most calls are one I can see the audience. Nevertheless, glad to, really honored to be invited to talk to the Ron Brown Scholar family. So Mike Woodward, the Director of Education and Civic Engagement at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. And I think if you had told me when I was in high school that I was going to go into education, I would have been like, there is no way possible that that's going to happen. I'm a first generation college graduate. I wear that as a part of my identity with pride, and it's informed a lot of how I've moved in the space. I'm originally from Spotsylvania, Virginia, and always said I had two loving parents who did the best they could with what they had, but what they had wasn't always enough. Uh, kind of stumbled into doing things that made me a competitive college applicant, really just trying to stay out of trouble and stay busy. And so was fortunate to, become a Ron Brown scholar. Still remember to this day, I sent Mr. Mallory a picture of the Park Hyatt at 24th and M when I walked past it maybe a few months ago, because that's the hotel where our scholar class met in 2004 when we found out that we were all Ron Brown scholars. And, the experience, and I start with that because honestly, my first introduction to philanthropy was as a scholarship recipient. I didn't know that the Ron Brown Scholar Program was a philanthropy program, or didn't really have a real interpretation of what the word philanthropy was. But it really made my college experience more feasible, right? Like I didn't have to worry about being able to financially cover my educational expenses. And so I went to Stanford for undergrad, and I think, it was a biomedical engineering major, human biology major, pre-med. When I was growing up, it was if you're good at math and science, be a doctor. If you're good at English and history, be a lawyer. And I had pretty limited exposure outside of that. And I would say the through line, though, was I was always volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club in East Palo Alto. And with other Ron Brown scholars, we started some summer programs. And so there was always this through line of education. And then I started a student group while I was on campus called FLIP, which stood for First Gen Low Income Partnership. And that was kind of where advocacy first came into my experience. It just became increasingly clear that we were having a lot of conversations behind closed doors around our experiences as students who were the first in our family to go to college or from low income households. And the elephant in the room was that the vast, vast, vast majority of my peers had financial resources that were seemingly abundant, but some of us were living quite the opposite experience. I remember I would tell, when I would talk to college classmates, they would be like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you experienced that growing up. Like, that sounds like that only happens on TV." And then I remember I would call my family and they would be like, "People don't have money like that. Like, that only happens on TV." Right. So then I started to think about what I kind of coined the duality of mutual ignorance, right? Where it's by design that we are separated in many regards along class issues to not have proximity and visibility into how other people live. And I just believe firmly that there's power in proximity. That said, shortly after finishing at Stanford, I moved to New Orleans to start a nonprofit with another Ron Brown scholar, actually Naveen Mahmood, and it's called Project Skill Build, and it was really centered around adult education. In fact, Ron Brown were the first folks that gave us any sort of seed funding to launch that initiative. And we worked with folks who had nonviolent offenses on their record, who were unhoused and or unemployed, to really learn skills in construction, plumbing, and electrical work, uh, and partner with some labor folks to make that happen. Secured enough funding to relocate here permanently. Did that for several years, went to graduate school, Tulane School of Public Health, and, always knew in the back of my head that public education was something I was interested in and passionate about at that point, but they didn't have an education program. I had a scholarship to support my time there, but my angle was public education is public health because the more educated society tends to be a healthier one. And then realized somewhere in that process that I wanted to work with younger people. And so when I completed grad school, I actually dissolved the nonprofit Project Skill Build, but it became a part of almost like an M&A. It became a part of the local Habitat for Humanity chapter because I had trouble finding a successor. I really wanted the work to sustain, even if it wasn't done under the name of Project Skill Build. So they absorbed the methodology, and to this day, they still engage in that work, even if it looks a little bit different than how it originally did. And decided I wanted to teach. So I did Teach for America. I was non-traditional in the sense that I wasn't straight out of undergraduate. I was a little bit older. And I knew I only wanted to be in New Orleans. It was becoming home at that point in time. And, was fortunate to become a Bezos Educator Scholar, which is where I met Ray. And I would say that the reasons I taught high school math, um, calculus, statistics, pre-calculus, and the reasons I left the classroom were not related to young people. Like I always, just cherish my relationships with my students and their families. But it was more around like some of the bureaucratic things that were happening in the building, like leadership challenges. And then quite frankly, we don't pay teachers what they deserve, right? And I had some opportunities to move on and do things differently. So then I led a college access and success program called College Track here in New Orleans. It was kind of like a principal role, but an after school program. We had about 500 students across the city and provided, social, emotional, academic, and financial supports to first generation college students from low income households. So I felt like in many ways it allowed me to work with miniature versions of myself, younger versions of myself. And Ray pops up again. Like I take college tours. I bring young people to Durham, North Carolina. Ray's an undergrad at Duke, and he volunteers to give a tour to 50 plus young people from New Orleans. And so what I think you can gain from this story is that Ron Brown continues to enter and re-enter your life in many ways, and the relationships are core to that. In my time at College Track, I wore several hats. First foray with like high level fundraising. So was managing a team of 55 plus folks, had an annual budget of about 40 million a year, and really, that was the reintroduction to philanthropy in an institutional philanthropy sense. And quite frankly, I was pretty frustrated. I think there were a few experiences that made me realize that this was a sector that maybe I should go in. I'll start by saying I always had mentors who said, like, if you don't like the way something's happening, like, why don't you do something about it? So, firstly, I had a lot of local donors in New Orleans who supported our work. They lived on one side of town, and our site was in the Ninth Ward, which was the site which was the part of the city that was hit hardest by Hurricane Katrina. And so many of those donors, I could not get them to come into that building. Like they were like, "Oh, it's so far, it's too far." If you've ever been to New Orleans, you know that if you have a car, you can get anywhere in 20 minutes. But what they really meant was they weren't comfortable in that neighborhood, right? I went to a fundraising gala that was much farther away physically, saw so many of them, but they wouldn't come to our site. So I was like, you know, you have a lot of folks who they get the tax deduction, they write the check, and you need people who are going to write the check, but like they're not necessarily committed to the work in the same way. Mm. And then I would say the second thing that became increasingly clear to me is that we weren't going to direct service our way out of the challenges we face as society. So we were coming through the pandemic at that point in time. We had just gone through an administration. We don't need to name names, but that I thought did more harm than good for sure. And I was like, I'm interested in systems change. I'm interested in policy and organizing and so on. And so I wasn't even actively looking for a role, but this is how networking and relationships work. There was a role that was created at the Shop Foundation that was explicitly focused on the U.S. South. Someone I had met 20 years prior was like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know if you're looking, but like this role is meant for you. So I ultimately left college track. I joined the Shop Foundation for Public Education as a regional program officer leading our U.S. South work. In October of 2022. And at SHOT, we primarily fund grassroots organizing, advocacy, narrative work, and research around public education and really ensuring that all young people have an opportunity to learn and ultimately thrive. So that's my story in a nutshell and kind of what's brought me to here. And then most recently, I became our director of education and civic engagement.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you walking through that. So you've seen things in the sectors from a lot of different angles. How do you articulate to other people the role that you think philanthropy can and should play with all of the other stakeholders in addressing all of these challenges? And knowing you, I'm sure you have things that you would like the field of philanthropy to improve on, and that you want to push them to do better. What
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? On where it sits in the ecosystem, and then what more or less, maybe doing less is also the answer too.
Yeah.
What do you
Uh,
think?
so I guess I would say in terms of what role does philanthropy play? Well, first, let me start by saying I think philanthropy didn't begin with foundations. And so I just want to kind of separate those two long before there were, endowed institutions. And I think this is particularly relevant for a Black audience. Like Black folks have been practicing philanthropy through mutual aid and church networks and fraternal organizations and collective child rearing and civic associations and just all types of ways. And I think that the most transformative investments in education have often come from communities that had the least wealth, but had the most commitment to one another, right? Philanthropy is the love of mankind, the love of humankind. And I think sometimes that gets lost, particularly in institutional philanthropy as a sector, when there's an over reliance on, ROI and what can be measured and what's quote unquote evidence based and who determines what is evidence and so on and so forth. That said, philanthropy has often served as the funding mechanism for quote unquote civil society. So a lot of nonprofit organizations uh, apply for grants to foundations to carry out their missions. And I think, there are so many different forms of philanthropy that in the form of grant making, be it larger foundations that give globally, that give nationally, that give to specific issue areas, right? So be it education or health or what have you. You have a lot of like community foundations, family foundations, and so on and so forth. The history of institutional philanthropy is not a pretty one. It's one where particularly in the US South, like most of the money that is the principal, I guess I should say this, like a lot of institutional philanthropy, they have what's called the 5% rule, which means that, for most foundations, you have to spend or give away 5% of your assets each year to maintain your tax status. Um, well, that corpus, which is like the endowment, is based on some wealth that was accumulated by someone or group of folks. As you can imagine, in the South, and not just in the South, a lot of that wealth was generated on the extraction of land from Native folks and the extraction of labor and life from Black folks, right? Uh, and then the idea is that you give 5% in assets away in perpetuity each year to improve the livelihoods of community members. And meanwhile, you invest the other 95% to kind of sustain yourself so that you can exist in perpetuity. The other thing I would say is that when you think about our history, there's really little to no accountability or restrictions on philanthropy either. I mean, even when we think about Brown v. Board in 1954, and I'm zooming through history a bit, you had foundations who felt like they were loving mankind or humankind by creating pathways for white people to go to private schools, right? Because they were like, well, desegregating schools is bad for people. And so, what can we do to help society? What we can do is help build private schools. And so, within 10 years of Brown v. Board, the number of private schools in this country quadrupled. That's not coincidence. That's by design. And there was a lot of philanthropic investment that made that happen. So I say all that to say that while philanthropy, by definition, is the love of humankind, it has done a lot of good and it has done a lot of harm, which probably brings me to like, what should philanthropy do more of? I think philanthropy should take more risk. I think philanthropy should dig into its own history and be honest about it. I think philanthropy needs to shift from a place of charity to being a place of healing and to make repair for the harm that's been done in this country and in the world. And there are pockets where that's happening, right? So you have groups like the Mission Investors Exchange, where folks are really coming together and saying, like, well, what are we doing with this other 95%? What is our history like? Let's put it out there. Because for far too long, and I don't want to pick on individual foundations, but you have folks who were leading campaigns to stop smoke, to get folks to stop smoking cigarettes, and they were invested in cigarette companies, right? Or you have, and there are just countless examples of that, or funders that are working to curb negative environmental impacts, but then are invested in fossil fuel companies, right? And so, if 5% of your money is working to do good, 95% of your money is doing harm, what's the net, right? So you do have folks that are thinking more around how can we put this 95% to use in a way that both generates revenue and allows us to stay here in perpetuity, but also like mitigates harm or does good. Or you have folks who are saying, you know what, like given the moment, given where we are, like 5% is not enough. And if that means that we need to no longer exist, like we're going to no longer exist. We're going to spin down, which means like, the Gates Foundation just announced that by 2045, they're not going to be around, which means that they're going to start spending that 95 for not expecting to quote unquote regenerate it. So, we've seen some good practices. And then I think the other one I would say is like really trusting community. I think we put a lot of money and time and effort into measuring what success looks like. And I think what it actually does is kind of pigeonholes like our ability to dream, because I think some of the greatest solutions to the problems we face as a society aren't things that can be easily measured in a 1, 2, 3 year grant cycle or strategic plan. Like some of these solutions require generational investment, which too few folks in philanthropy are willing to make.
Yeah, that's well said. I wanted to ask you about a particular form of foundation that I've known about, but I don't know if it gets as much attention as there's certainly the form of foundation that supports civil society, nonprofits, as you said. Can you help me understand these foundations that are essentially attached to school districts, and that where you kind of talked about some themes of how there's a lack of accountability with what philanthropy can do with their wealth in pursuit of education in terms of what they choose to fund and what they care about. that's different than what the government can do. But then there are these foundations that kind of sit in, I don't know if I'm sure they, I don't know what their tax status exactly is, but can you kind of explain what that relationship is and how, when foundations want to step in to support government, what that means or looks like, or what different rules or dynamics might exist versus supporting nonprofits?
Yeah, so I imagine you're talking about entities like the Oakland Public Education Fund,
Right.
or a
Yeah.
lot of, especially larger school districts have, these philanthropic arms. I would say that, and I'm not a historian on this specifically, but I do know a bit about it. We're actually working to start one in New Orleans right now, where essentially, if you think about school funding, uh, it has largely been a product of a combination of federal, state, and local investment, right? The local investment is largely based on property tax. And so when you think about like how schools are funded, typically more affluent municipalities have more money in their school district. And there are many states and federal dollars that previously were available and to an extent still are, but are being threatened to kind of be to kind of course correct for that inequity just based on like housing segregation and property values and ownership versus renter rates and so on. I would say in large part the charter school movement played a role in districts starting to create their own foundation. So as charter schools became more prevalent, what I think a lot of public school, like traditional public schools, district schools started to realize was that there are these schools that are, claiming to be public schools that have private boards that are governing them, that are getting public money and private money in the form of philanthropy. And so when districts have a philanthropic arm, it essentially allows for that philanthropy to be like a fiscal agent for philanthropic investment, right? So let's say a district wants to create an innovation fund or a new initiative. They could, but the money's not there from the government to support it. They could figure out a way to raise dollars from institutional philanthropy, from individuals, you name it, to cover the cost of some of the various innovations or programmatic initiatives that they want to employ.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. Maybe, can you give us a little insight on what it would mean to start one in New Orleans and what work you're doing now? And, you know,
Yeah. So I will say when I taught at a charter school, and I don't know how much folks on the call know, but New Orleans, but it's kind of an anomaly, and many people describe it as a charter school experiment playground around like what urban education could look like. So I start back there because I think that context is important for where we are now. You basically had, the first charter school in New Orleans opened in the '90s. The Recovery School District was a state takeover initiative that started in 2003. A lot of people think Recovery School District came about post Katrina in 2005 because recovery's in the name. But essentially, the idea was that the state was going to take over every failing public school, meaning it had a D or F on its report card, its school performance score, and the state would run it. Hurricane Katrina happened, schools are shut down. Also, the Recovery School District realized that there were so many schools that had D's or F's that it didn't quote unquote have the capacity. So it focused its efforts on New Orleans. According to the state constitution, the state wasn't able to directly run schools. Like that is a municipal, responsibility. All eyes were on New Orleans. So much money was coming in. And so I think you had a lot of charter networks saw New Orleans as an opportunity so that the state could be legally above board and that it wasn't directly running the schools, but it could still have influence in a way that maybe it didn't before. And so you had a decentralized system, all charter schools. It since came back to the district, but it looks very different than what it looked like before. And so just 2 years ago, the superintendent at the time, who has since left, and that's an important note, committed to instead of closing, or closing when a charter school closed, instead of just this redisseminating students across the district to a bunch of different schools, she was going to have the district run the school directly. Within a year of that school being open, there was an effort to shut the school down from the school board and the new superintendent and some power brokers in the city. I, as someone who sits as the co-chair of the Greater New Orleans Funders Network Education Action Table, was unsettled by what I was seeing. talk to the family that the school was named after and really try to put a plan in place to ensure that things were fair and equitable. So, as the only school that was district run, it was the only school that couldn't receive philanthropic support because, as I mentioned earlier, charter schools could. And you had a lot of community members who wanted the school to stay open for a multitude of reasons. One of which was that it was a district run school, and but could not give its money to support this school's operation. And the primary reason that was used to justify its closure were financial sustainability issues. So, we're starting out with having the Foundation for Louisiana serve as a fiscal agent so that there legally is a pathway to make investments in this school. But we're also exploring, like, what would it look like for the district itself to have that infrastructure and capacity?
Yeah, very cool. Over, yeah, and I guess like the last 3 decades, I don't know that any other city or state has a history quite like the New Orleans education sector. So it's yeah, interesting case study for sure. We're running closer to the end on time here. What parting words would you have for people who are trying to figure out where in education they fit, even for a season, for a time, a chapter of their careers? How would you make sense of the impact that you want to have in your life in the world with the opportunities that exist in philanthropy? How should somebody think about that? When does that make sense to do so? You certainly have worn many hats before getting here.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about that before we close?
Yeah, I mean, one, I hope folks, stay in touch and right, feel free to share. You can share my phone number, email address, what have you. I'd love to, because I think for every person it's different, and I need to understand like what their circumstances are. That said, I always encourage folks to feel their passion. I think that to pursue their passion, I'm a firm believer that passion plus problem equals purpose. Meaning, if you can find something that you enjoy, your passion, and you can figure out a way to use that passion to address a problem in society, then you've tapped into your purpose. And for me, education was that. I think the barrier initially was a financial one. Like, I grew up in poverty and I didn't want that for my lineage or my family. So I was like, I don't know if I want to go into education. And while unfortunately teachers don't make, as much as I thought I needed, I think one of the things is you don't need to make as much as you think you need when you are in college and coming out. At least that's been my experience. And then two, education is broader than just teaching, right? So to your point around education philanthropy, it's one of the most networked sectors, philanthropy broadly. And I guess I would say, philanthropy is pretty networked by geography, by racial identity, and by issue area. So there are all of these organizations where their sole purpose is to bring people in philanthropy together. I would encourage everybody, if you're interested in philanthropy, be it education or otherwise, to follow ABFE, ABFE. It used to stand for Association of Black Foundation Executives, but it's now just like Black Folks in Philanthropy. Or if you work at a nonprofit, like, you can be a member of AFI. It's not just funders, but like that is the one-stop shop. Every year there's an annual conference, and folks in the sector who identify as Black come together to, learn, but to like be in community and so on and so forth. There are always job boards that a lot of these organizations have. And Ray, I can send you more stuff for you to send out as well. But I think about, what is the impact that you want to make? Traditionally in philanthropy, people said there were three ways to get into the sector. The first of which was to be an expert, get a PhD in something. And, a lot of people from academia go into philanthropy. The second was to start at a, really junior level at a foundation and work your way up. So the current CEO of the Kellogg Foundation has been there, over 35 years, but hasn't been the CEO that entire time, right? And then the third of which is to become independently wealthy and start your own foundation. I will say in the last 10 years, and this is probably like a part of my timing, there's a greater value on practitioners in the sector, right? Folks want people who've done the work to fund the work. And so I always say that, part of my mission is to be the funder I wish I had. The same way that previously I wanted to be the adult that I wish I had when I was younger, right? And so I always think about what can I do differently so that those who come after me have a better experience than I did along my journey.
Man, well said. Man, I really appreciate your time. I've been benefiting from your mentorship for over a decade now, and so I just appreciate you giving us a little time to share it with other folks too. You're everywhere and not hard to find. So if anybody's interested in connecting with with Mike, just let me know, and I can certainly make that connection. But thank you, man. This was great, very insightful, and I appreciate the time.
Of course, thrilled to be invited, and just love and appreciate everything that RBS continues to do for scholars.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Awesome, man. Thank you. So, y'all, we're going to shift to the final session of our time today. I'm going to invite our panelists to come to join this side of the session and just make sure that everything is set up for them. Awesome. Let's see here. Let me make sure I can see and hear y'all. Okay, awesome. And let me make sure I can spotlight you and give y'all the floor. Before I talk about our final panel, I just want to kind of recap all that we've done so far today. We started with Dr. Ryan Stewart, who talked about a breadth of his experience from teaching middle school math and science, all the way to being the Secretary of Education for the state of New Mexico, and all of the different angles and perspectives on education that he has accumulated, and his thoughts on where power sits in the education system, where can we really move the needle, what is noise that reaches the headlines versus what are the things that really matter the most. And I'll circle back to some of his words before I introduce our panelists. We then shifted to Jimmy and Sean, and talked a little bit about Tyrone as well, who are there are plenty of scholars building education technology companies and tools, and conducting research in order to make sure that all of the technological advancement that we get to benefit as consumers or in other industries, that we can figure out ways for that to benefit students and teachers. And so Jimmy is building AI technology that helps special ed teachers build and talk about IEPs with their students and their parents, and certainly make that process for paperwork a bit more efficient. And then Sean is using AI to reinforce the democratic process that should happen with schools and for school boards, and that everybody has a voice and is involved, but leveraging AI to make that more real. That if we want more voices in the room to be a part of the conversation, that we need different tools to make sure that everybody in all languages at all times in all spaces has access to be able to do that. And then Jimmy came back and talked more about his research for assessments. We then transitioned to Mike Woodward, who just wrapped up talking about the role of philanthropy in education, and where it sits amidst all of the different stakeholders, and how you can think about impacting a career from that perspective. But I want to go back to something that Ryan said from the very beginning, that it is not debatable that the number one thing that matters for students, regardless of who they are or where they are, is the quality of the teacher that's in front of them. We can talk about a lot of other things that matter, and all of those things do matter. This is not a mutually exclusive statement. But he said that by far, if you care about wanting to make sure that students have the best education experience that they have, the person that is in front of them day to day is the number one factor in terms of whether that happens or not. And so I wanted to make sure that we ended a talk about education with speaking to not just educators, but educator leaders, educator researchers, folks who are thinking not just about the frontier of teaching, but also helping to teach other educators, and to spread their knowledge and expertise. And so I want to thank both of you for taking the time to be the perfect cap for a great event that we've had so far, and for making the time at the end of a Friday to do so. I'm going to start with having you both introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about, you can talk a little bit about your background as well, and what you're currently doing now. And I'm going to start with some follow-up conversations based on your respective backgrounds. And then I want to kind of expand it out to a more general conversation that I think both of you will provide some insights on, about what does teaching mean in 2026? What does the future of teaching mean? What will it take for us to recruit more Ron Brown scholars to want to become educators? And what is on the horizon for the field overall? So, yeah, just have either one of y'all to start with introductions, and then we'll jump in from there.
Okay, well, I guess my mic's off, so I'll start. My name is Malika Donaldson. I'm RBS 1998, and I am an associate professor of education and child study at Smith College. I did my training at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and my background is in human development, learning, and teaching. I started off in the field as a kindergarten teacher, actually, and I sort of wove my way to becoming a kindergarten teacher. I didn't have that in mind when I was in RBS. But once I stepped into a classroom, once I started interacting with children, being in school spaces, I knew that was where I needed to be for my life. Uh, So at Smith, I teach a class called Intro to the Learning Sciences, kind of like the science of how people learn, but I make it very interdisciplinary, thinking about not just neuroscience or, cognitive science or things like that, but also social dynamics and relationships and all those things that impact everyday how we learn, how we teach. And I also teach teachers in our teacher education program, focusing more on elementary. That's my very, 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 very quick bio. If there's more you want to know, let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Lincoln. Great to have you.
Um, Errol Saunders, RBS 02. There's so many things. So for a long time, I was a history teacher in Haven, Connecticut at the Hopkins School. Just recently moved to Massachusetts after 20 years at Hopkins. So now I'm teaching at a progressive school in Weston, Massachusetts. While I was at Hopkins, I was the executive director of the Pathfinder program, which is a program that's a lot like Prep for Prep, but without paying so much attention to test scores for the ability of students to stay in. I'm currently an advanced doctoral student in the Department of Curriculum Teaching at Columbia, where my research is about the impact that students' belonging has on their achievement when they go to school outside of their neighborhood. So kids who go to magnet schools. I have also served on the school board of Common Ground Charter School in New Haven for about 7 years. So I have a sense of how schools are working both in private schools, in public charter schools, and then in the Haven district as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you. Always good to see you. And at least in my generation of scholars, anybody who's ever interested in education, look to certainly both of you, but Errol for me in particular in terms of making sense of where we can fit. I guess there's so many things I've been wanting to dive in with both of you on. I want to start with the kind of the cliche AI question because it came up earlier today. And maybe we can kind of broaden it out to technology. And the reason why I'm starting with that is because a lot of scholars who are also passionate about education are also passionate about other things, are also thinking about technology, also thinking about how they can make a difference. But many of them certainly have close relationships with educators. Some of them were raised by educators. Some of them were former educators, but some of them are not. And so I was wondering if y'all could give certainly not a monolith that you could speak for all educators and teachers everywhere. But what is your sense of what this latest wave of technology entering the classroom means or doesn't mean, doesn't move the needle as much as we would want to or hope, certainly could or does? What is your optimism, pessimism for what uh, AI can mean for education from a teacher's perspective?
Do you want to start, Errol, or should I go?
You can start if you'd like. That's fine. I just default to going back to mute. I think like all educational technologies, to the extent that they are being pushed to replace an educator or an educator's judgment, they're just going to end up expanding the kinds of inequalities that they are being mobilized to try to fight, right? Like you began this session by saying that we all know the most important thing is the educator in front of you, and so often educational technologies do this dual role. They are either trying to solve something about the educator in front of you, or trying to make sure that the educator in front of you doesn't have to be skilled, right? And we just continuously come back to the idea that this educator is important, right? And so at the school I currently teach at, we are actually being really, really systematic in thinking about how AI can be used to further student learning in our classrooms using our judgment, right? Now, notice that's really important. Further student learning, that's the goal. It's their learning, not their like not how fast they can spit out a paper, but like their learning, their cognitive processes, right? The things that we want them to know and be able to do, right? AI in many ways can bypass the things that they know and are able to do. And so we're being really conscious about how we want to employ AI to augment what they know and are able to do. And then I also mentioned with our teacher judgment, with our specific judgment, right? We have spent years in front of students and working with students and thinking about how to serve all kinds of students. And these are tools that are not necessarily designed for students and not designed for the kinds of uses that our students might be using them for. And so we are being really systematic about that, and we're also being really systematic with our students. And we're in an era where, like, I tell my students not just their the learning goals, but like how using AI might make it harder for them to do that kind of learning going forward, right? I'm teaching you this way because I want you to be able to do these things that AI would steal from you, right? And so I'm really skeptical. I'm really skeptical that AI will be deployed in ways that will be beneficial for Black and Brown students or low income students or first generation students, because I'm really skeptical that they're being deployed to augment teachers rather than to try to get around what teachers are doing or to try to replace a need for seasoned professionals to help guide student learning.
Yeah, I would add to that. I appreciate what you shared, Errol, and I echo some of the pieces that you're bringing forward. I think when I think about AI, the thing that makes me the most nervous as somebody that's teaching in a higher ed environment, but it's applicable to K-12 as well, is that there are skills that I'm trying to teach my students, specific skills, and if students in a context of high pressure to get straight A's or worried about their futures or taking too heavy of schedules or things like that, if they feel stretched and feel a lot of pressure, maybe they would turn to AI to offload some of their tasks and kind of be streamline things and be really efficient. And what I've gotten into the habit of saying as AI has been progressing is actually being really transparent with students and saying, this, my underlying thing with this is not about content transmission. It's not that you're gonna step into the classroom. I am going to beam information into your brain and now you have learned. It's that we are a community. We are a set of people that bring our whole selves into a space and we're going to work together and I'm going to facilitate an experience. And we also part of that is me being transparent as a teacher about my own experiences and bringing that into the conversation as it's relevant, and also having trust. And so I tell them things like, I'm going to give you a task that's really hard, and note that this is a hard task and it should not be fast or efficient. It's not going to be efficient. You're going to go down rabbit holes. You're going to explore things. And that's the point. So I don't want, when that happens and you feel like you might be doing the wrong thing, you're not. That's what happens when I do the same work sometimes, even being someone who's done it for decades. And I have found students find some comfort in that, in knowing that, okay, it's not expected to just be completely efficient all the time. I think we lose a lot when we prioritize content transmission and efficiency, which is something I think AI can do. I think teaching, I agree completely with what Ryan said, the quality of the teacher in front of them day to day, that is the heart of it. And I would also want to add, in thinking about AI, I would rather invest in our people than in the technologies, because it's the people that are going to be sitting there in the room, building community, knowing kids, knowing students of all ages. That to me is the number one priority. That's why I think teaching is extraordinary. We have the opportunity to inspire and prepare to go into every field imaginable and to create new things. So when it comes to AI, I feel I don't want students, when they're novices at something, before they have a chance to really learn it and practice it, to offload it and not get that practice, because the practice, the inefficiency, that's how you build the foundation for deeper learning and being able to get into more complex things and get into creative things and innovation. You've got to have that foundation. So I've seen some instances of people using really curated chatbots in ways that are really helpful, and maybe AI tutors and things like that. But when it comes to help me outline my paper, help me, paraphrase my paper, things like that, I think that's where professors get at least I get kind of nervous that people are doing that. I will say I've been heartened that a lot of my students really are resisting AI. They want the critical thinking, the communication skills, and all of that, but it's still a really high pressure space for students. So I'll pause there.
I don't know if I can just add a little bit. And just, one of the things we talk about with our students is an old IBM adage from way back in the day when IBM basically said no machine can make a decision, right? All decisions have to go through people because only people can be held accountable, right? And I think what we talk about with our students is like, you're going to be held accountable for this work. So you want to be responsible for it, right? And just really thinking about that, both in terms of like talking to students, but also thinking about that writ large with regard to AI, right? And trying to talk to students about what grades are supposed to mean or what they mean at our school and how they are supposed to help people understand what kinds of skills and knowledges they have. And so when you use a shortcut that way, you will be held accountable for having those skills, even if you don't have them. And so are you shortchanging yourself? Right? We still live in a world where people actually need to have these kinds of cognitive skills in order to go through both the workplace and life. And so, we're just really, really, that's why it makes me feel so nervous because when I see folks advocating for these AI futures in education, they are often trying to get around the need for people. But then what happens if your AI teacher does it wrong or you don't learn anything? Who do we hold accountable for that? At least in the current model, we have some sort of understandings about what accountability looks like, and we're deploying technologies without thinking about accountability or responsibility.
Yeah, that's well said, Errol. I think last week was reminded of that IBM statement too, and I think it's very applicable. So I want to circle back to Ryan's core comment and then what we just talked about here. I've heard different friends or classmates of mine from school talking about people basically doing exactly what you said, Errol, trying to leverage AI for all of its good. But if you really read into what the motives are, is to get around this bottleneck that is this educator that is in front of them. That is how it is thought about and designed, and that if you can redo education, you wouldn't do that. But given what we know about research and what is true, that the quality of the educators in front of them, I want us to focus on this next part of the conversation about that. What are those levers that influence whether that is true for most students? And certainly, I'm not even convinced that maybe AI and technology is a big part of that conversation. And I'm not just talking about just pay or just all of the hats that they wear, but what is y'all's sense of where the needle gets moved today on the quality of that educator that's in front of them, and what amidst all of the things and other topics that people will hear about education and that aren't really rooted in that reality, if we're designing around that human and the impact that they can have, and we believe in that, what are the things that should be talked about more as it relates to that, as opposed to how do we get this kid to sit in front of a screen for 3 hours a day so that this teacher can not, or to be somewhere else, or to help them with other things. Yeah. Anyway, I hope that you can make sense of these thoughts. I don't really have sense of them, which is why I'm asking for experts. So forgive me if my question is clear.
I
But
have a lot of thoughts about this
okay,
as you're
cool.
saying it. Because I've been thinking and writing about this lately, and just thinking about one of the big things that's happening is people get burnt out as teachers and end up exiting the profession, even people who are very promising, who have gone through training and things like that. And I think part of it is that we need to invest in teachers as professionals and not as standing in front of the class, holding a space, facilitating or just like administering a curriculum that was given to them by the school district. People who go through teacher education programs in particular are taught a whole bunch of things and develop philosophy of education, and they have beliefs. They come and they bring values, beliefs, passion, and skill. And also, when they first enter the classroom, they need the time, resources and support to develop that skill. Just as any skill, physician, a plumber, a writer, you start in one place and then over your career, you practice, you expand. And that means the first year that you're in the classroom is probably not going to be quite as good as maybe the second year, the third year, the 10th year. It's a craft. And I think that a lot of public districts at least will have scripted curriculum or really prescribed pacing guides or things like that. Not everywhere, but there's a lot of schools that have that. And I think it undermines the teacher's sense of professionalism. And I think that professionalism, pride, autonomy, community, having other teachers and mentors in their community, that to me builds a quality educator. That builds someone who enters with passion and conviction and a desire to do great work and is able to stay despite whatever trials they come up against. You need other people. I always come back to that. I always, like, I know it maybe, I don't know how much this comes into the discourse, but schools where people feel, where educators feel supported, seen, their administrators have their back, they're connected to their colleagues, they have opportunities to create curriculum, create initiatives, they're going to be happier. I mean, in addition to getting fair pay and other things like that. So I know I want to pass the mic to Errol, but that's my first take on this question.
Well, I interpreted this question a little bit differently, but I would echo everything that Malika is saying. There's this excellent article that I always go back. You know how you have the things that you're just, ooh, I love that one. And Mary Kennedy wrote an article called Parsing the Practice of Teaching that I just love so much because she talks about teaching as a series of irreconcilable tensions, right? And that a good teacher navigates these irreconcilable tensions in order to get students to learn. And what I liked about that article specifically is that it didn't necessarily mean you had to be a particular style of teaching in order to be an effective teacher, right? And in my experience, I think that the thing that makes good teachers good is that they're able to foster curiosity, trust, and motivation in their students. And I actually don't care how they do that, right? If you can get your students to be curious, to trust you through the process, and to be motivated to do a little bit of hard work along the way, they'll learn the things that you need them to learn. And if you're doing that by being a martinet from the 19th century, okay, fine, right? If you're doing that in an incredibly progressive way, that's my particular preference, but that's just a style preference. I'm getting my students to be curious about the world around them, trust me in the process of learning, and motivated to do the work to learn things, and that's all we get. Where I think I don't know any, because teachers are so poorly paid compared to other professionals with the same kind of education, right? I just don't know anyone who cares that much more. Like I don't know that many people who enter education for the money, and when they leave, the money is like the the last of the issues, right? Like I could deal with this stuff if I were paid more, but since I'm not paid more, I don't want to deal with all these other things. And I think what we need to really examine as a society is Americans really don't like social safety. And so we actually make schools do almost all of the social service safety net things that could be handled in other places. So fine, don't pay teachers anymore. I mean, I prefer to be paid more, but like maybe if you let me not have to be the first responder for mental health crises. Let me not be the person, I was literally told in the pandemic, oh yeah, you're gonna go to work with a mask on. And like hopefully in this building that hasn't no AC because it was built 100 years ago, you'll be fine, right? Like maybe if we weren't required to be the people who are trying to figure out whether or not a student is in emotional distress or physical distress, or if what they're going through is poverty versus being abused at home or things like that. Maybe if we could rely on our students being well fed when they came to school, right? There are all of these things that schools are asked to do, and teachers are the first responders for them, right? And so maybe we could make teaching more appealing for lots more people or get rid of some of that burnout, right? Because by lessening the role of the school in society, if the right in other places where they have phenomenal schools like Finland, the school doesn't do all the things. Other aspects of the government do the things, and the kids come well fed and clean and they go to school, right? And so I think we just have this tension of how do we get those people who can foster curiosity, trust, and motivation in the classroom, and who are also able to do all these things we are not trained for. Or rather, you'll get like I'll have a PD on how to identify students who are in distress. So I'm basically getting a social worker's PD in, a social worker's career PD one day, and like we've got something else to do the next day too.
And I would say those one-off kind of professional developments are only an introduction, and that's not, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Something that you're saying, Errol, makes me think. I wrote a book where I was looking at. I study learning from mistakes in context, and I looked at four different public school kindergarten classrooms. And one of the biggest things that jumped out to me immediately as a former teacher in that grade is the importance of resources. And I think when we have concepts like a big push for grit and resilience and all these things, it's like, sure, grit, resilience, and money. And, you know, fewer children in each classroom, more books, more resources, more aides. Instead, when we have such constrained resources in some of the schools, and then you expect, as Errol is describing, the teacher to expand that space and fill it, it's just doesn't even make sense. And there are many people in this country whose teachers get all the resources they need and they're able to excel. And so I think that's something else that needs to be in the mix too. People cannot, and I say that as someone who has taught in drastically different types of classrooms, and I'm a different teacher depending on the resources that I have, just because you can't make something from nothing.
Yeah, that's well said. I knew this would happen, and we're already a few minutes over time. I want to be respectful of the time that y'all gave. If you will, I want to ask just one more question that I think will be insightful for the audience. The next generation of educators, you all are both in one form or fashion involved in directly teaching them, mentoring them, working with them, and that we hope and want that to include Ron Brown scholars as well. What is your sense of the pipeline of talent that is interested in teaching and wants to become educators? And is it not necessarily sufficient in number? I think the answer is probably no. But is it sufficient in other things that you think should be important, or insufficient in other ways that ultimately get us closer to this reality that that number one factor of the quality educator in front is possible? Is it as simple as if all of us didn't go to, I don't know, Wall Street or consulting and chose to do teaching? Is that does it? Or is it that, yeah, I guess I'm curious about the person, the people who are doing this and the new blood that will come in over time. What are your thoughts on what are you seeing of young aspiring educators saying, feeling about the profession? What could we, if we were to make a pitch to more RBS to consider this, how would we do so, and how would we talk about it in context of all the other things that they might be thinking about and feeling and worrying about if they're interested in doing this?
Well, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is I recognize attention all the time. In teacher education, I see that the students have if they want to become a public school teacher specifically, there's an extraordinarily high amount of requirements that you must complete in order to receive state certification. And that includes certain courses and or majors, tests, practicums, being in the field, observations. It's really difficult to navigate. You have to sustain a certain grade point. So just for anyone going for it, it's really challenging. And it's just strange that that happens at the same time that there's a teacher shortage. And so we need more people in the room, but the requirements are so stringent. And so there's this mismatch. I have seen over the past several years, many programs come up, things like Boston Teacher Residency or DC Fellows or things like that, that I think are a good way to bridge the gap. When I advise students, I tell them people who are very interested in education who might decide that the undergraduate pathway isn't right for them. I'm like, teaching is there. Teaching's going to be there. And if and you can, there are other pathways that you can get this. There are pathways that pay you. There are pathways that are free that have been cropping up because we do have that dire teacher shortage. And so I'm hoping that that to me feels hopeful that there's pathways for people to get to it without debt and all these other things. For the sake of time, I'll let Errol speak on that.
So for 20 years, I was involved at a pretty high level in one of these alternate pathways, right? Where we were, go through Summer Bridge and then the Pathfinder program, where part of what we did is try to get young people comfortable in classrooms and really using an apprenticeship model to kind of get folks to learn some of the things that they could do to be an effective teacher. We did run up against some of like the state certification roadblocks, but so we weren't ever able to supplant a teacher education program. But what we could do is get students that feeling for our teacher interns, that feeling of like, I can have a huge impact, right? And so when we're thinking about Ron Brown scholars, right, I just don't think there's any way that you can have more of an impact than being a teacher. And it hits you here, right? It just hits you right here. This morning, to be full disclosure, I'm currently in Medford, Massachusetts. This morning, I woke up in New Haven, Connecticut, because my advisees from the class of 2026, which meant that they entered Hopkins School in the fall of 2020, high pandemic, they graduated. And, that's like 6 hours of driving back and forth. But the idea that like, a kid asked, can you come to my graduation? My advisees, because they cared 6 years. 6 years ago, I told them on their first day of school, I told them that I would be there on the last day. And they just wanted to make sure. Because at Hopkins, we have a receiving line where we shake every graduate's hand and wish them good luck before they go off to their families. And that is just like, it's so special. And so to the extent that we can get young people in spaces where they can understand that feeling, because it's that feeling that keeps people going, right? When you're frustrated at admin, when the test scores didn't come in how you want, and then a kid says, oh, you remember when you taught me how to write a paragraph? Then you're like, oh, I'm back in it. I'm back in it. Yes, I remember that, right? Because right now we're in an educational testing ecosystem where we aren't quite sure, it's my opinion, we aren't quite sure what we ought to be testing, but we think we ought to be testing something, right? And so it's not necessarily, the work that people are doing isn't necessarily rewarded in that kind of way with high test scores or things like that. But those human connections where you are making a difference and you feel it in your body, that is a really difficult thing to achieve in the modern world. Right? If Marx says that the marker of an industrial society is that the worker is alienated from the means of production, right? In teaching, there's all kinds of means going on. But when you've got that kid in front of you, you are not alienated. You're in it, right? You're in it. You know what you need to do. You know the mark that you're making on the world, right? And you know that it's important. And that's just so hard to get these days. So, that's what I would say is like, we just need to get people in front of classrooms as often as we can under whatever kinds of conditions we can get them in there so that they can feel what it means to make a difference. And that will get them through, that'll get them 80% of the way through all of the rigmarole that we have the teachers go through.
I that really resonates with me, Errol, and I was going to say something similar. So I'm glad you said it and you said it well. That idea of jumping from the theoretical, the hypothetical of what something might be to seeing what it is. And the places I've seen people really dive into teaching are when they had a lot of varied experiences in different schools, different grade levels over time with time to process it. So immersing yourself in educational spaces, and that would apply to any field, getting out there, knowing more of what you're getting into in advance, so that it's less a dream in your mind and more tangible, and that human side is coming out. And the other thing I would say is that if there's any curiosity at all, it's worth exploring. Learning and teaching is a part of every vocation. So spending time in schools or different types of settings that are focused on education, I think is a valuable experience for anyone, because you're going to go into some field, every field, and you're going to learn and or teach at almost every day. So worth looking into. I taught like many years ago because I've been in academia all these years. But one of the most impactful things I've ever done in my life is teach children to read. And it's those kids are, graduates from college now, and they are like, you taught me how to read. They still remember me. And it gives me chills every time. It is life-giving work. It is relational, and it is worth considering.
Wow. I can't think of any better way to cap this if we had to. I know we could continue and should continue the conversation, but reframing all of the lack of appreciation and respect for teachers that we kind of started outlining to that this is a profession that offers something that other folks are extremely jealous of, that they don't get out of their work and that they desperately want. Uh, and my hope is that we were helpful in getting at least one more of our own to consider it and to taste it and to feel it and to see if this is something that they can see themselves in. So thank you so much, both of you, for your thoughtfulness, for your insightfulness, for sharing your expertise. There's like maybe 20 more questions that I had brainstormed that we didn't even talk about. And there's so many other things that are in y'all's backgrounds of areas of expertise that we didn't talk about. Can you all share just a little bit about if folks are interested in chatting with you, what's the best way to reach out or how people can just keep up with what you're doing and where you are?
I am the only Malika Donaldson in the world. So if you Google Malika Donaldson, you will find me. You'll find my webpage, my faculty page. My CV is online. You can see what kinds of stuff I'm publishing and getting into. And I have a contact link on my website, malikadonaldson.com. So you can find me that way.
Awesome. Thank you, Malika.
I'm also lucky enough that if you Google me, it's me. My nieces and nephews think I'm somehow famous because that's true. I'm just like, no, I've been in schools a while. So yeah, and then I'm old enough where my Gmail is my first name, dot my last name, right? And I've been a public official in multiple kind of capacities. So my phone number has stayed the same since 1999, and my email has been a matter of public record. So y'all can just email and call, and it'll work out.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much for not just the time that you gave here, but your willingness to continue to help and support other folks who are looking to follow in your footsteps. Whenever you are ready to or want to, I'll just be wrapping up. So feel free to come off camera and or to get back to your day. Thank you for giving me an extra 15 minutes and really appreciate it. What an afternoon. What a 3 hours and 15 minutes that we had. We, every one of these summits is really special. Whether we did it on artificial intelligence in the fall, we did it on healthcare and biotech earlier this year, we did it on education. We'll do it on academia later in this year. We'll do it on economics later in this year. The insightfulness and clarity that I get on where I sit, where I want to sit, and the own impact that I have always comes from hearing other people talk about why they are where they are and how they got there. And amidst a world where we're no shortage on information, but that means there's a lot of noise on the things that matter to us the most. I found that these venues were very refreshing and insightful and go a level deeper than scrolling or whatever the latest news headline is. And so I hope that you feel the same. But at minimum, I do these for very selfish reasons to learn a lot from very smart friends across the different industries. And my hope is that y'all were able to benefit too. I started this event talking about how these summits are supposed to kickstart something. They're not just supposed to serve as evergreen content that folks can always take inspiration from, where we'll post it on our website and on our YouTube channel so that other folks interested in education over time can learn from it. But there are pockets forming of little mini Avenger teams across different industries that share common values, but bring different skill sets. And we want education to be one of those places where that happens. And it's already forming. And so as you think about your own career and what you are wanting to do in the education space, think about Malika and Harold. Think about Mike and Danielle, who wasn't able to make it today. Think about Jimmy and Sean and Tyrone. Think about Ryan. Think about all of these folks who are also thinking about some of the similar things that you are from a different perspective and how we can all plug in together. And so just want to thank you all for being a part of this community and for being a part of this today. If there's any way that I can help make a connection happen across maybe some of the folks that were listed or other folks that you might want to connect with who are interested in education, please feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, we'll look forward to doing another version of this, perhaps on education in the future, but certainly other domains. And I'll make sure that you have the link to the video to share out. I'm sure you know of somebody who wanted to be here or should have been here. And fortunately, with recordings, we can get as close as possible to the live reenactment. So please share that with them. And whether that's just a video, whether that's about our organization overall, we want to make sure that we're serving as that catalyst and having that ripple effect. Thank y'all so much for being here. I appreciate your time, and hope you have a great rest of your Friday and your weekend. And I'll see you next time.